the forge, the day begins with fuel that was ordinary rather than exotic. Charcoal remained a standard choice, though some places also drew on coal that could be had nearby. What matters is the work itself. Medieval smithing heated iron and shaped it, which kept the craft distinct from ore smelting and extraction. That distinction gave the shop its everyday rhythm. You are not standing beside the first making of metal, but beside the reshaping of it into useful form. In that sense, the smithy belongs to the long middle of iron, where heat, hammering, and practical judgment turn raw material into something ready for use. Small-scale work like this often left little waste, so the shop reads less like a grand industrial center than a place of steady maintenance. That maintenance mattered because village tools could stay serviceable without a large production center standing behind them. A hoe, a blade, or a hinge did not need to travel far to be made whole again. In that local world, repair and replacement sat close together, and the smithy could serve horses alongside domestic, commercial, and agricultural ironwork. Market Bosworth makes that pairing especially clear, where small-scale repair production stands next to horseshoeing in pre-industrial smithies. The same shop that returned edge or shape to a familiar tool could also fit iron to an animal that pulled, carried, and kept the wider economy moving. So the forge was more than a place of black heat and labor. It was part of the ordinary infrastructure that kept fields, lanes, and market work in motion. That sort of workshop depended on trained hands, and apprenticeship remained a long-lived way of organizing that learning. A craft did not simply appear in the worker, it was passed on through years of directed practice, with entry shaped by more than family habit alone. Guilds could set expectations, private contracts could bind a learner to a master, and courts could also shape who entered and on what terms. Those arrangements made smithing a social institution as well as a technical one. By closing time, the forge was not just a room where iron had been altered, it was a place where skill, obligation, and reputation had all been kept in balance. That is how the journey settles, from fuel and heat to repair and service, to the wider human order that kept the craft alive. Hearth bottoms, slag, and hammer scale identify ironsmithing where the debris remains. In an English medieval settlement, a forge could leave a trace in floor debris even when its walls had disappeared. When roof, timber, and fittings have gone, the hard residue remains, and that residue still points to heat managed for metalwork. A working place of this kind did not need to be grand to be legible. It only needed enough repeated labor to scatter the dark, brittle waste of iron shaping across the surface where the smith stood. That is why the clue matters so much. It ties a room to practical craft without asking for romance or spectacle. The forge was part of ordinary settlement life, where useful iron had to be kept serviceable and where a modest corner could hold an important trade. Even a small spread of debris could preserve the outline of purpose. The residue supports smithing activity and a maintenance scale reading of the place. The scene is not one of display. It is a place defined by service, by repeated heat, and by the plain hard leftovers that a smith leaves behind. Because the residue stays low and scattered, it fits a working floor rather than a ceremonial space, and it keeps the forge grounded in labor instead of legend. That pattern suits a craft whose value was measured in usefulness, not in display or ceremony. The hearth itself could sit at floor level or be raised above it, so one excavated form cannot define every forge. That range matters because a smith needed a controlled bed for heat, but not one fixed shape for every setting. Charcoal was the standard forge fuel, while some regions also used locally available coal. The fuel choice reflects practical adaptation, since the craft worked with what could be gathered and burned well in a given place. A raised hearth and a ground-level hearth both served the same basic purpose. They kept the fire useful, concentrated, and close enough for the worker to manage. The structure was never about ornament. It was about making heat behave. Hearths could vary in form, and practical heat control remained central to smithing. A low or raised hearth marks the working place without reconstructing its wider arrangement. That practical center explains why one surviving form can only show a possibility, not a rule, and why different settlements could solve the same problem in different ways. A smith close to a hearth like this was working with control, not excess, and that control shaped everything from fuel choice to the pace at which heat could be renewed through the working day over and over. This was smithing in the narrow, proper sense. Iron was heated and shaped, which keeps the craft distinct from ore smelting and extraction. The smith was not pulling metal from rock or reducing raw ore in a mining landscape. The task was to work iron that had already been made available and then alter its form. That difference matters because it separates the forge from the places where iron begins and keeps attention on the shop where it is made useful. A thin scatter of debris can confirm ironwork, and small quantities of waste often fit minor local metalworking better than a larger production site. Limited leftovers support a cautious maintenance scale inference rather than a large production claim. Such a site could repair, adjust, or finish pieces that had already entered daily life, which is a very different thing from making a landscape of extraction. The forge is important not because it swelled into a furnace complex, but because it kept iron serviceable. Its scale tells you something about the neighborhood around it: small needs, regular use, and a craft that stayed close to demand. Even the faintest trace of waste belongs to that kind of routine, where utility mattered more than output, and where the finished result was measured by continued use. Thin waste may indicate repeated or maintenance scale work, though it does not fix a single episode. Urban craft clusters from London and Norwich offer a useful comparison, but they are not the countryside default. In those towns, smiths worked among other trades, and close to dense demand, a bounded urban comparison shaped by streets, markets, and movement. That urban arrangement helps explain how metalworking could gather in compact quarters without becoming a giant industry. It also keeps us from assuming that every forge sat in the same relation to its neighbors. Wealden ironworking beside streams shows something different again, a specialized regional landscape of water-linked ironworking at a larger scale. That setting belonged to its own economy and its own geography, and it should not be confused with ordinary repair smithing. The contrast is useful because it keeps the smaller forge in proportion. Not every smith lived in a busy craft quarter, and not every ironworking place belonged to an industrial zone. The shop we are following sits nearer to everyday settlement life, where iron was handled because people nearby needed it kept in order. Looking at the city and the streamside works sharpens the picture of the modest forge and gives the small hearth its proper place within a wider world of labor. A small forge in that setting serves local maintenance needs without implying large production. It answers local demand, keeps objects in circulation, and remains part of the daily fabric rather than the grander machinery of extraction or trade at any distance. That kind of shop mattered because settlements ran on maintenance as much as on building. A village or town with a forge could keep small iron problems from growing into larger ones, and that quiet capability shaped daily life more than a dramatic display ever could. The smith worked near demand, and the distance between need and remedy was short. Tools, fittings, and other useful iron objects stayed in circulation because someone could return them to working order. That service gave the forge a social role as well as a technical one. It sat inside the ordinary economy of keeping things usable, where the value of a craft was measured in continuity. A modest hearth and a modest waste trail therefore imply more than isolated labor. They point to a place embedded in the settlement's habits, a place where repair was expected and where the presence of ironwork made the community a little more durable. This is why small scale does not mean small importance. The work could be narrow in range and still matter to everyone who depended on steady, everyday function. A forge like this remained close to common life, not because it was simple, but because it was necessary. That practical role is almost invisible until something fails, which is why the forge belonged to routine rather than ceremony, and why its influence reached farther than its size. In a small place, usefulness can be the strongest kind of presence for everyone. Once the coals are banked, the forge is no longer just a room with fuel in it. It becomes a prepared place, ready to receive iron and turn raw heat into usable change. That shift is small in appearance and large in consequence. A hearth that burns steadily, whether low or raised, gives the smith a dependable center from which the rest of the work can begin. The shop does not need flourish or ceremony to reach that point. It needs readiness, fuel, and the discipline to keep heat where it belongs. From there, the craft can proceed in its ordinary rhythm, as the craft heated and shaped iron. The important thing is not drama, but sequence. The coals come first, because without them there is no managed fire, and without managed fire there is no ironwork. In that quiet order, the forge takes on its purpose. What began as a scatter of hard residue, a simple hearth, and a modest fuel bed, now stands as a working center of settlement life. The forge's role, therefore, remains within these supported boundaries. That is the quiet threshold of the forge, not a scene of spectacle, but the practical moment when potential becomes use. A settled hearth and a patient worker are enough to carry the craft forward, one controlled heat at a time in the everyday life around it. That modest arrangement also kept the craft tied to settlement life rather than to an abstract technical ideal. Heat mattered because it made useful shaping possible, while the surrounding room remained a place defined by practical service. The hearth did not announce a separate world, it placed metalwork inside the ordinary organization of the community. In that setting, a small residue could carry a large practical meaning without needing an elaborate reconstruction. Its practical meaning stayed local. At the edge of the city, the forge is first understood through its working surfaces: clay or stone hearths, bellows, anvils, slag, and hammer scale belong together in a practical smithy setting. The arrangement is plain, but the plainness matters because ironworking in towns depended on durable places for heat, pressure, and residue. A hearth held the fire, bellows sustained it, an anvil offered a hard face for shaping, slag and hammer scale gathered where iron was struck and cleaned. None of these things stands alone for long. Workshop tool sets can overlap with other metalworking skills, so one object rarely proves a single craft by itself. Tools and fittings could serve overlapping practical roles within the craft. What gives the room its identity is the cluster, not the single item. Once those pieces appear together, the place reads as a smithy in the practical sense that mattered most to the town around it. The floor, the hearth, and the tools all belong to the same routine of heating, striking, and clearing away the remnants of iron. That routine does not need ceremony to be clear. It turns a room into a workplace, and a workplace into part of the urban fabric, where metal was handled as a regular necessity rather than as a special display. Its setting also explains why fragments matter. They gather around use, not display, and around labor, not ceremony. In that modest way, the forge enters the story fully formed, with its purpose already visible in the materials that define it. That cluster becomes more meaningful when the floor itself is read as part of the craft. Site debris clearly marks ironsmithing without naming the customer or commission behind the work itself. The scattered waste of iron, the clean surfaces, and the residue left by repeated heating and striking belong to a working room, not to a named patron or a fixed order of products. Material waste can prove activity, but it does not prove a fixed product line. A smith may have made tools, fittings, repairs, or small pieces for different uses, and the debris still looks similar because the same basic acts leave the same traces. That is why the room can be understood as ironsmithing without being narrowed to one category of output. It is also why the workshop's social role remains broader than a single transaction. The place served ordinary urban needs, and those needs could shift from one moment to another. Different demands could leave different traces, while debris does not fix the product line. The point is not to assign a list of finished things to the room. The point is to recognize a practical environment in which heating, shaping, and cleaning were the lasting acts. In such a space, the tools matter because they work together, and the debris matters because it preserves that joint work in a form that can outlast the specific job. The workshop is therefore read through pattern rather than through a single completed object, and the pattern is enough to keep the smithy visible as a place of continual use. Oxford's craft history places the forge inside a changing civic world rather than a fixed rulebook. Local organization shifted across time, so smiths did not always occupy the same position in the town, the same degree of oversight, or the same relation to other craftsmen. Oxford's regulations changed over time, so craft organization did not remain constant. That variation matters because a working smithy is not a tidy category that stays unchanged from one period to the next. Its place in urban life could be practical, negotiated, and shaped by local custom. Early medieval Norwich gives a bounded comparison. There, small-scale ironsmithing near an urban site shows what compact work could look like, but only within a limited setting. It offers a useful scale, not a universal pattern. A port or market town could host ironworking in narrow spaces among buyers, roads, and other craft rooms without forcing every workshop into the same civic arrangement. Taken together, those examples keep the forge small and historically specific. It belongs to a town where craft organization could alter, where neighbors and streets mattered, and where ironwork sat inside a broader urban rhythm. The result is neither a grand town-wide pattern nor a rigid legal one. It is a working place shaped by local order, by changing arrangements, and by the ordinary pressure of urban life. That is enough to keep the forge legible without turning it into a formula. The comparison stays narrow, but it still clarifies the range. The view widens again when the forge is set beside the Wealden example. That specialized case ties production, water, and later development together in a bounded regional comparison centered on water-linked ironworking. The result was a district in which the history of ironwork was linked to land, flow, and later building in ways that outlasted any one workshop. This matters for the smaller smithy because it shows how an ironworking place can belong to a larger economy without becoming grand or remote. A modest forge near an urban site does not need to become a major ironworking center in order to matter. It can exist as one node among supply, transport, and later growth, while still remaining a small room with practical tasks. The landscape gives the building context, but the building remains modest in scale. That balance keeps the story grounded. A craft room can be part of a wider productive district and still have a sharply local purpose. It can serve immediate urban needs while standing inside patterns that spread beyond the city. The Wealden case makes that larger connection visible without forcing every workshop into the same shape. Its value lies in scale and relation, not in sameness. The forge, therefore, belongs to a broad world of production, yet it still works through ordinary tools, ordinary surfaces, and ordinary labor. That combination of local use and regional setting is what gives the room its weight. It also keeps production from seeming isolated or purely local. What remains of the room is enough to keep the story in motion. The hearth, the bellows, the anvil, and the settled waste all point to repeated use rather than to a single frozen moment. Smithing involved heating and shaping iron, with the debris preserving only part of that work. The debris on the floor matches repeated use, not a minute-by-minute script. That restraint is useful because it keeps the room grounded in the life of the town. A smithy built on clay or stone, fed by bellows, and marked by slag and hammer scale, does not need embellishment to feel real. Its importance lies in the ordinary fact of making and mending metal where people lived and worked. The room stays modest, but modest does not mean slight. It means useful, repeated, and integrated with other needs around it. Oxford's shifting craft order, Norwich's small urban comparison, and the Wealden landscape of production all keep that modesty in view. They place the forge inside changing systems without turning it into a fixed formula. The result is a workshop that is clear in function and broad in implication. It belongs to a world where local organization could shift, where a single room could serve different kinds of ironwork, and where waste underfoot could mark a day of labor. That is enough to carry the section forward. The coals are understood as part of a room already prepared by use, and the workshop can remain open to the next task without changing its character, without ever leaving the room vague. Such flexibility mattered because local craft was never only a question of tools. It also depended on how a town recognized workers, attached obligations to learning, and allowed familiar work to continue. The room could therefore hold continuity and change together, with practical metalwork remaining visible even as institutional language shifted. That balance gives the next passage its proper scale. Charcoal was the dependable fuel of the smithy, the material that could be kept ready for heating iron. In some local settings, coal also appears, but only as a regional choice rather than a general rule. Around the hearth, the workshop gathered its plain equipment: bellows to feed air, an anvil to receive the blows, and the usual signs of ironworking in slag and hammer scale. Those fittings mark a place built for smithing, not for display or ceremony. The forge mattered because it held heat in a controlled way and put that heat to use. Iron could be brought into condition there, straightened, renewed, or shaped again after wear. The room did not need grand size to perform that work. Its purpose was clearer in the arrangement of fuel and tools than in any outward show. Charcoal was the standard fuel, while coal marked a regional variation. Where coal appears, it belongs to local circumstance, not to a universal practice. The smithy, in this sense, was defined less by scale than by readiness. Fuel at hand, air under command, metal waiting at the anvil, and the familiar dust of shaping gathered below. That combination is enough to place the forge within the ordinary life of repair and making. It also shows why the room could stay modest and still matter. Every part served the same practical end, so the workshop was measured by usefulness, not by size, and the fuel was part of that discipline. A smithy ordered that way could keep a community supplied with serviceable iron without display. Hammer scale fell as a normal byproduct of shaping iron, a thin scatter that settled wherever hammer and hot metal met. Its presence identifies smithing activity because it belongs to work done at the forge rather than to some unrelated task. When that waste appears only in small patches, it fits maintenance scale labor more naturally than a large production complex. The shop therefore fits broad maintenance work without fixing specific repair actions or a heavy manufacturing role. The amount of debris places the forge in the world of everyday practical needs, not in the world of broad output. A village or household smithy could answer those needs with modest resources and repeated attention. The floor carried that quiet sign of use because each bright fleck marked a moment when iron had been reheated and changed. Such traces suit a working space that serves the same tasks again and again, sharpening, mending, refitting, and reworking what already existed. The smith did not need a vast spread of waste to prove activity. Small scatter was enough to show a place where iron received careful hands, and where the result was measured usefulness rather than volume. The smallness of the scatter also keeps the setting modest, because nothing in it points to a place built for bulk output or constant throughput. It is the residue of a repair culture, where the same bench, hearth, and anvil serve many separate jobs across ordinary days. That quiet residue is part of the room's identity on a small scale. Urban concentration gives one useful frame, and London shows how crowded craft districts could gather many metalworking activities close together. That example makes scale visible, along with specialization and neighborhood density. It does not, however, define every forge. A village smithy worked within a different order of space and demand, even when it shared tools and habits with broader craft traditions. Kopang strengthens that point, because its overlapping metalworking skills warn against forcing one tool into one craft. Kopang shows that craft categories could overlap, but the comparison remains bounded. In that setting, the value of a tool lay in what it helped accomplish, not in a fixed title attached to the hand that used it. The port and the city show breadth. The smaller forge shows usefulness. Between those settings lies a common world of making and repair, where the same working knowledge could answer different needs without becoming confused. The smith of a smaller community therefore belongs to a wider tradition, but not to the urban density of a trading quarter. The rural forge belonged to a local settlement context, rather than a dense urban cluster. That wider pattern keeps the village forge from shrinking into a romantic isolate. It was part of a shared craft culture, yet it remained ordinary in its reach and direct in its purpose. It could also cross related tasks without losing identity, because practical skill mattered more than neat labels. The boundaries were functional, not rigid, and that is the point. Water mattered in some regional ironworking systems, and the streamside workshops of the Weald show that clearly. In those places, moving water helped organize a broader chain of production and gave the landscape a role in the craft, yet that arrangement was not universal. A village forge could function without a stream beside it, because the smithy belonged to the stage where iron was already ready for heat. Iron shaping is the work of smithing itself. The metal is heated, worked, straightened, joined, and renewed. Ore reduction belongs elsewhere in the chain, earlier and farther from the finished tool. Keeping those stages distinct matters because it preserves the proper order of the craft. The forge receives iron and changes its form. It does not turn raw ore into metal in the first place. That difference would have been understood through practice, not instruction. The workshop answered what lay before the anvil, and its job was complete when the iron came away in a more useful state. Regional systems could shape some iron economies, but they did not determine every smithy. A place without streamside water still belonged to the same larger world of iron, provided it worked the stage of shaping rather than the stage of smelting. That separation keeps the craft clear and the workshop easy to place in the chain of making. It also means that the smithy's success depended on readiness and skill at the bench, not on owning the whole sequence from ore to object. Smithing shaped iron, while ore reduction belonged elsewhere. The stage matters more than the landscape alone. Seen together, these features make the waking of the coals a practical threshold. Charcoal and coal in some local settings give the forge its heat. Bellows, hearth, anvil, slag, and hammer scale place it within the working furniture of smithing. Small waste scatters point to maintenance scale labor. Broader craft centers and mixed skills show that the village shop belonged to a wider world without copying its scale. And water, where it mattered, shaped only some regional systems. The forge therefore stands as a modest workplace with a clear job to heat iron already in hand and return it in better shape. That role served the ordinary needs of a community, from repeated repair to the steady keeping of tools and fittings in service. The room did not need grandeur to matter. It needed a dependable fire, familiar tools, and a pattern of work that could return again and again. In that calm arrangement, the coals come into usefulness and the smithy settles into its own kind of order. The same order also keeps the craft properly divided, with shaping here and ore work elsewhere, so the workshop stays focused on what the anvil can answer. The contrast with ore reduction keeps that usefulness in order. The forge works on iron already made, and that is enough for a room whose duty is repair. Waking the coals, then, means returning the shop to the steady business of heating, striking, and preserving what a community already depends on. A place set up in that way can begin its labor quietly, yet it already carries the promise of repaired iron and useful metal. Ore reduction remained a separate operation, so the forge's role stayed focused on shaping available iron. That boundary clarifies why maintenance could be central without making the place a center of extraction. The distinction also keeps the settlement's craft economy in proportion. At a forge, the first task was readiness. Coals had to be brought back into working heat, and the place itself had to suit the fire that would follow. Some forges held their hearths at floor level, while others lifted them higher, so there was no single standard shape for the fire. That difference matters because a forge was built for work, not for display. Heat, air, stone, and metal formed one practical arrangement, and the arrangement changed with the task. A hearth close to the ground suited one way of handling iron, while a raised hearth suited another, yet both served the same purpose, making heat usable. The craft began with that control. Fire alone was not enough. It had to be contained, fed, and turned toward labor, so the forge became a place where the fire itself was part of the working method. In that sense, waking the coals was not a side note before real labor began. It was the opening condition for shaping, repairing, and returning iron to service. The fire was therefore not an abstract symbol of craft. It was a working tool within a working place, and the shape of the hearth helped determine how the whole task could proceed. That readiness also shaped the blacksmith's day, because the work began with preparing the place before iron could be taken up. A forge ready in this way joined fuel, bellows, and hearth into one controlled setting. The fire sat inside that setting, and the setting gave the fire its use. Even before the hammer fell, the craft depended on that ordered beginning. An anvil belonged with that hearth, as did bellows and the rough materials that held the fire in place. Together they point to shaping work carried out by hand and heat. The anvil offered a firm surface, the bellows fed the fire, and the hearth materials kept the working zone fit for repeated use. Nothing in that arrangement suggests ornament. Everything points toward iron being corrected, hammered, and brought back to serviceable form. The forge was therefore an active workplace, not a room arranged to be looked at. Its fittings were chosen for action, not for appearance. The blacksmith's skill began in managing those parts together, because iron had to be heated enough to answer the hammer, but not so far that the work lost control. A hearth, an anvil, and the bellows belonged to one process, and each part served the others. When the fire settled into the right shape, the smith treated the metal as something to be formed rather than merely heated. That practical order made the forge more than a place with fire in it. It was a setting built around transforming hard material into something usable. The same arrangement also allowed the fire to be adjusted as the work changed. A piece was straightened, flattened, or drawn out, with the tools around the hearth supporting each step. The craft was therefore defined by coordination. Heat, force, and support worked together, and the forge existed to keep them joined in a way that ordinary daily repair required. The result was a place where repair and shaping worked reliably under one roof, routinely. A single deposit held smithing traces without naming the people it served. That mattered because one place handled work for farmers, travelers, or townspeople, and the circle of use changed with local need. The mark left behind is local before it is social. Iron was being repaired, but the exact client group stayed broad. London and Norwich provide a useful comparison, yet they do not set a rule for every village yard or roadside place. A city forge and a smaller settlement forge shared the same basic purpose, but they did not have to share the same reach. A local working place answered a narrower demand and still left the same kind of trace. The forge kept tools serviceable, not because every visit followed a fixed social pattern. Some use belonged to people who lived nearby, some to those passing through, and some to the wider settlement around them. The point is not to assign a household to the hearth, but to recognize a place where iron work supported ordinary life. Comparison with larger urban settings helps only in that limited role. It shows that smithing was organized in different surroundings without losing its essential function. In a small place, the same kind of work fit a simpler rhythm and a narrower market. The ground below preserves only a brief mark of that activity, but the mark still points to repair as a recurring need. That kind of place served daily use first, and only secondarily any social distinction attached to the work. That helped hold settlements together. That steadiness mattered wherever iron wore down again. Metalworking did not always stay inside tidy boundaries. At Kopeng, workshop overlap shows that related skills mingled, so specialization needs careful handling. A smith's work sat beside other crafts, and the line between them was thinner than a neat category suggests. That matters because it keeps the blacksmith within a wider craft world without reducing the forge to a single sealed trade. Different workers shared space, borrowed habits, or answered neighboring demands. Some places looked mixed, and that mixture was part of the practical life of metalworking. The same yard carried more than one rhythm of labor. Later medieval water power entered some ironworking systems, but it did not belong to every blacksmith's yard. A wheel-driven method in some settings does not make it universal at all. A forge worked fully with muscle, hearth, and bellows alone. That keeps the craft tied to local arrangement rather than to one fixed sequence of tools. Specialization, therefore, appears as a tendency, not a hard wall. One worker shared a space, borrowed techniques, or met different needs without fitting a narrow label. That flexibility explains how ironwork survived in many settings without becoming identical. The craft adjusted to the place around it, and the place in turn shaped the work. A mixed workshop and a simple forge both belong to that larger story. Each shows that metalworking depended on practical combinations rather than on rigid boundaries. The result is a broader picture of craft life, one in which the smith's yard could be part of a larger working world and still remain a place for heating and shaping iron in practice. What remains is a forge place recurring in a small settlement deposit. That kind of trace points to repeated repair activity, not to a permanent workshop plan fixed in one shape forever. The place returned to use whenever iron needed attention, and the work stayed practical enough to recur without leaving a full daily timetable behind. The important point is the habit of repair. A community that kept tools, fittings, and other iron objects in service needed a place where worn material was made usable again. The forge answered that need by joining fuel, air, and heat to the local pattern of life. It did not have to stand as a grand institution to matter. It mattered because ordinary use brought iron back to it. That kind of working place fits a settlement where repair was repeated, brief, and necessary. The forge's importance rested on its practical role within the settlement. What the ground keeps is the sense of return, heat, shaping, rest, and then heat again when the need arose. That rhythm is enough to place the forge within daily life. It shows a craft that served the community without needing a fixed architectural script. The coals were woken when needed, the metal was brought back into shape, and the place settled down until the next call on its heat. From there, the story can continue into the next set of useful tasks, where iron service becomes part of a wider round of work. That pattern gave the settlement an ordinary working rhythm. It leaves a modest but steady place for the next practical demands still ahead. At a medieval forge, the first practical fact is fuel, and fuel was never uniform. Charcoal was widespread, made through woodland work and control of heat, while coal appeared only in some regions and did not define every smith's day. That difference mattered because the fire did not belong to an abstract craft alone. It belonged to the place that fed it. A smith, at the edge of a settlement, worked inside an economy of timber, trade, and transport, and the material under the hearth could shape the rhythm of the building. Fuel variation belonged to the broader pattern of smithing. Even before iron was struck, the forge announced its character through what could be gathered nearby and what came from farther off. The workshop was therefore less a fixed recipe than a practical answer to where ironwork happened. Charcoal was standard, while coal appears as a regional variation. Either way, the opening of the fire was part of a regional choice, not a single medieval rule. When the hearth came alive, it stood as the first sign that ironwork was a local craft, not a standardized one. Its heat followed the resources around it, and that fact separated one workshop from another. Some forges could lean on the lightness of charcoal, while others worked with the heavier presence of coal and the habits that came with it. Fuel choice connects the forge to regional ironworking, while local conditions shaped the comparison. Inside the building, the floor and surrounding debris pointed to heating and shaping rather than any grand permanent furnace. Tiny scatters of slag, the glassy waste left when iron is worked hot, fit small-scale smithing carried out for nearby needs. A smith who kept that sort of fire going was not necessarily turning out masses of finished goods. The traces fit a workshop that handled limited jobs, one by one, with repeated heating and careful adjustment. The work itself happened on site because iron had to be raised to working heat before it could be bent, hammered, or cleaned up for use. The craft involved heating and shaping iron, while the debris leaves the exact sequence open. That rhythm made the forge a place of interruption and return, where a few pieces could occupy the same hearth more than once. It also meant the room around the fire mattered as much as the fire itself, because tools, fuel, and ironwork belonged to the working place. Nothing in that setting suggests a grand industrial hall. It suggests a compact place built for repeated heating, steady handling, and the ordinary pressure of repairable things. The scattered waste belongs to that modest scale, where the important output was not quantity alone, but the readiness to meet a local need. A countryside forge could be busy without being large, and its small pile of slag matched that kind of work. In that sense, the debris and the fire line belonged to the same practical world. That small scale suited a craft measured by usefulness, not spectacle or display. Compared with the better-known town settings of London and Norwich, the countryside forge cannot simply be assumed to have copied urban habits. Those towns provide useful points of comparison, but they also show how easily a busy market center can blur into a specialized craft district with more traffic, more hands, and more kinds of metalwork moving through one place. A rural smith had fewer pressures to behave that way, and the scale of the work stayed closer to the homes, fields, and lanes it served. The small slag scatters fit a forge that handled local jobs and modest output, not a yard built for the scale of a great town industry. That difference matters because a village smith served a nearby community that needed practical fixes, not a system measured by urban crowds. A countryside workshop could be settled into the ordinary pace of farm life, where tools and ironwork could reach the same hearth in broad maintenance work. London and Norwich show the range of medieval smithing, but neither town sets the terms for every rural hearth. The village forge was smaller, more direct, and more closely tied to immediate use. Its work was not anonymous mass production, it was the everyday maintenance that kept local iron serviceable. In practical terms, the forge answered to the neighborhood before it answered to any wider market. That local pattern is what the slag scatters point toward, and it keeps the countryside workshop distinct from the urban examples beside it. Its modest size did not weaken the work, it simply matched the scale of nearby demand. Further north, Koupang warns that workshop tools and skills can overlap, so craft categories need to be handled with care. The same bench, the same hammering habits, or the same set of tongs could support more than one line of work, and a person trained in one task might drift into another as demand changed. That overlap keeps the forge from being boxed too neatly into a single label. It also helps explain why a workshop site may look simpler from a distance than it was in use. The Wealden iron landscape offers another angle. There, ironwork belonged to a water-linked regional setting where streams, roots, woodland, and extraction areas shaped the movement of material across the countryside. That landscape was not the same thing as ordinary repair smithing at a village edge. It belonged to a broader chain in which iron was managed across distance and connected to the land that produced and moved it. Seen beside that, a small workshop with slag and heat scars looks different in purpose and scale. One world organized metal as a regional commodity, the other kept iron serviceable for daily life. The contrast between them shows that not every forge sat inside the same social and economic pattern. Some were stitched into local maintenance, while others were part of a wider iron district. Even a plain hearth could sit at the meeting point of several skills. That makes the smith harder to picture as a single, fixed figure. That flexibility mattered in a region where ironwork could move between extraction, transport, and shaping without becoming one fixed craft entirely. Taken together, the forge points to the hot end of the iron chain. The smith heated iron on site and shaped it there, but the ore-supplying part of the process belonged elsewhere, beyond the forge itself. That division of labor made the workshop a place of transformation rather than origin. By the time the metal reached the hearth, earlier steps had already carried it through other hands and other ground. In the forge, the practical task was to bring the metal back to working heat, direct it under the hammer, and return it to use. The surrounding debris, the fuel choice, and the scale of the waste all fit that role. They placed the building inside a wider landscape of supply and movement, where one craft depended on another stage already completed. It is a modest conclusion, but an important one. The forge was not the whole story of iron, only the point where iron became useful in the village world. The same space could warm a bar, narrow a strip, or bring an edge back into line, and each of those jobs depended on the heat being ready when needed. That is why the coals matter at the start. They mark the moment when raw material enters the workshop's own rhythm. In that quiet balance, the building belongs to the middle of a much longer chain, and the countryside beyond it remains part of the story without being the same thing as the forge itself. Its work begins in heat, then hands the metal back to the life of the settlement, ready for whatever use comes next. That exchange kept the forge connected to wider regional life while leaving its own work local. Heat, shaping, and reuse were enough to explain its practical importance in the settlement. A smithy in a medieval settlement was usually a working room first and a landmark second. It might be recognized from its ironwork and heat-darkened fittings, yet the sequence of its life is harder to recover than the fact of its presence. A few ironworking traces inside a settlement show that metal was worked there, but they do not prove a permanent specialist yard set apart from every other task. A bounded conclusion remains smaller and steadier, a place where repairs, fittings, and everyday iron needs were handled within ordinary settlement life. That kind of forge could be modest, renewed, or temporary, and still matter greatly to the people around it. It might sit near a street, within a yard, or toward a settlement edge without losing its purpose. What joins these settings is not ceremony, but use, heat, metal, and trained hands met where local demand required them, and the work answered to practical need rather than display. Within English medieval settlements, the cautious picture is not a universal blueprint, but a local arrangement shaped by place, scale, and habit. The coals, therefore, belong to a local economy of broad repair and replacement, serving nearby needs without a fixed product list. In that sense, waking the coals is less a dramatic beginning than a practical one, the start of useful labor inside a settled world that needed steady hands more than grand show. It belonged to the settlement's daily rhythm, where keeping iron serviceable mattered as much as making it first. It kept ordinary life supplied with farm tools and household hinges. In a town, the forge belonged to a crowded craft world rather than a solitary rural corner. London places smithing beside other artisans, each trade working within the same civic fabric, so ironwork there should not be taken as the pattern for countryside settlements. Norwich points to an earlier urban setting in which smithing already had a place in town life, long before anyone could imagine one village model for all of England. These towns matter because they show how the forge could sit among many skilled hands, market routines, and close neighbors without becoming the only form of craft space. The urban smith still shaped useful iron, yet the setting around that labor was different from an open village yard or an isolated hamlet edge. Town demand could support varied work, but the comparison remains general rather than a product list. London and Norwich therefore offer comparison, not repetition. They show a craft embedded in dense settlement life, where the smithy was one practical room among others, and where work, exchange, and daily order overlapped. The coals wake here inside a more compressed world, one in which the forge answers to neighbors, markets, and municipal rhythms rather than to a lone household economy. The frame keeps the smith from becoming a country stereotype. It keeps the craft local, useful, and adaptable, even when several artisans share the same streets and courts. The forge remains a place of service, but now its service belongs to town life and the crowded habits that went with it. Not every forge belonged to a town street. The Wealden case shows ironworking could develop in a streamside production landscape, where water, woodland, and access to ore shaped the setting around the hearth. In that kind of place, a work area becomes legible through its parts. Bellows, anvils, hearths, and waste together describe the smithy, even if they do not fix its daily timetable. Taken together, those elements show repeated labor and practical sequence, not a single isolated strike of luck. The forge there belongs to a wider economy of extraction, fuel, transport, and craft, tied closely to what the district could supply and move. Streamside production also reminds us that ironworking was not only an urban convenience or a village repair stop. It could be embedded in a landscape organized around making, where the ground itself helped determine how the work endured. That makes the smithy part of a production district rather than an isolated stall. Bellows without a hearth would say too little, and a hearth without waste would say less still. The cluster together gives the place its working identity. Once the coals are stirred in that setting, the scene broadens beyond a single building into the practical geography that supported the trade. The craft depended on supplies, on access, and on movement through the surrounding district, so local did not mean simple. It meant rooted in place, linked to resource and route, and able to continue because the landscape made room for it. The forge was therefore one point within a larger working pattern, steady enough to last and ordinary enough to remain part of daily production. A forge was also a social place because skill was learned, recognized, and handed on through apprenticeship and guild practice. Those arrangements belonged to the ordering of the trade, not to ash on the floor, and they gave the smithy a human frame as well as a physical one. A young worker entered that frame before the craft could fully be called their own, while a master stood within it because the trade carried rules of training and standing that reached beyond the hearth. The forge connected ironwork to apprenticeship, guilds, contracts, courts, and changing Oxford practice. It belonged to a community of makers whose identity rested partly on instruction and partly on the ability to answer real demand. That social frame kept the forge from becoming merely a place of hammering. It joined repair to status in a way that mattered across the settlement. Apprenticeship and guild habit did not change the iron itself, yet they changed the life around the iron, setting expectations for entry, competence, and standing. The smithy could be modest without being trivial, because it stood inside a web of roles, and the waking coals marked a place in the shared order of craft life over time. Institutional practice shaped training and standing, not a fixed allocation of particular tasks, that made the forge part of local trust as well as local labor. Its heat mattered, but so did the ties that surrounded it, because a craft survived by being known, taught, and accepted over time, again and again. Across English medieval settlements, the safest picture is a cautious forge scene, not a single blueprint for every place. The smithy was local, practical, and adaptable, changing with town, streamside district, yard, or settlement edge, while still remaining a place where iron was heated and made useful. It did not need to look the same everywhere to serve its purpose. What matters is the common function: repair, replacement, and everyday ironwork folded into ordinary settlement life. The forge belonged to the local economy of usefulness, and its value rested in readiness. A tool that needed straightening, a hinge that needed fitting, iron that needed another round of heat. These were the kinds of demands that gave the work its shape. No grand ceremony was required, and no single arrangement could stand for all England. Yet within that variety, a recognizable craft space endured, modest in outline and durable in purpose. The coals sit naturally among the structures that kept a medieval community running, and the forge joins labor, training, and repair without fanfare. It is one of the quieter institutions of the settlement, important because people nearby depended on practical metalwork day after day. London, Norwich, Wealden, and the smaller places around them all belong to that broader pattern, though each does so on its own terms. The night therefore closes on a settled impression, not a universal model, but a working corner of English life, shaped by local need and kept alive by repeated use. In that corner, the coals are not dramatic symbols, they are the beginning of work that remained useful, grounded, and ready for the next task. Local variation therefore mattered more than any universal pattern of production across English settlements in practice. Limited debris supports a maintenance scale reading of settlement smithing. In that setting, the smith's work reads as maintenance first and production second, with reuse carrying more weight than novelty. Village tools could remain serviceable without a large production center standing behind them, because a bent fitting, a dulled edge, or a loosened fastener could be brought back into use through ordinary repair. The modest traces point to work having taken place, yet they do not name the exact tool that passed through the forge. That restraint matters because the scene is not one of abundant output or heavy dispersal, but of careful prolonging of use. A small workshop could keep plow gear, household fittings, and hand tools circulating with modest effort, and the settlement did not need a major industrial quarter to make that possible. The iron mattered less as finished display than as a material kept ready for service. In a countryside of limited surplus, that kind of practical attention carried real weight, since every restored object saved time, metal, and labor. It allowed a community to hold on to useful things a little longer, and it kept the local economy from treating every worn piece as a loss. The smith therefore belonged to the ordinary mechanics of continuity, where repair and reuse were part of the same settled rhythm, and where a small fire and a trained hand could make a notable difference in daily life. The traces left by that work show activity, but they do not settle the identity of every object repaired. Material waste marks the presence of heating, hammering, and reshaping, yet it can remain too general to assign one task or one tool with certainty. That is enough to place the smithing within a practical economy of upkeep. Iron did not have to be smelted beside the workshop for the shop to function, because bars, blanks, and salvaged pieces could reach smithies through trade links. A place away from smelting sites could still receive the metal needed for local repair, sometimes from routes that tied the settlement into wider exchange. The workshop then acted as a finishing point, where imported iron was turned toward the needs of the surrounding community. That arrangement kept the craft local in use, even when its materials came from farther away. It also separated primary production from maintenance, which is the more useful division here. The smith was not necessarily making ore into metal on the spot, he was making metal useful again, and that difference shapes the whole picture. A modest rural shop could matter so much because it stood near the end of a longer chain and translated delivered iron into repaired implements, straightened fittings, renewed edges, and objects fit to return to service. The route into the settlement mattered because it made repair possible, even when the forge itself stayed small and unassuming. That local finishing gave the settlement steady access to usable iron. Taken as a whole, the craft served continuity. A village did not have to wait for replacement from a large production center each time an iron piece bent, loosened, or wore down. Local smithing could keep tools serviceable through modest repairs and small adjustments, and that kept daily work moving. The practical consequence was straightforward. Equipment stayed in circulation longer, and the household or field did not have to absorb the delay of full replacement. This was iron work tied to use rather than display. The value lay in keeping things sound enough for another season of labor, not in producing a striking quantity of finished goods. That is why small-scale smithing can look so restrained and still matter deeply in practice. The useful object remained close to hand, and the craft quietly protected the settlement from wasteful loss. A practical tool or fitting could return to use without becoming a grand achievement, yet it eased the burden of ordinary work by keeping metal serviceable. London offers a historical contrast, because its concentration of craft activity shows what denser urban conditions could produce, but that pattern was not the countryside's norm. Norwich gives a better early medieval urban example, where modest ironsmithing stood beside settlement without requiring monumental scale. Together, those places show that size varied with setting. A town could host a capable workshop, and a village could do the same on a smaller scale, each answering different levels of demand without changing the basic logic of repair. The same practical landscape could also hold more than one kind of craft activity in close reach. Different artisans could occupy the same area, so a place tied to smithing need not put every task in one pair of hands. A settlement could contain several working hands within a shared quarter, and iron repair might sit alongside other labor rather than apart from it. That makes the smithy part of a wider social arrangement, not a sealed-off specialty. In such a setting, one person's work did not need to define the whole space. The area could host overlapping skills, shared tools, and neighboring trades that met practical needs in different ways. This matters for reading the workshop because it prevents an overly rigid picture of single-purpose buildings and isolated specialists. The forge space places iron work in the area, but it does not force every nearby activity into the same hands. One smith could handle repair while others occupied adjacent tasks, and the settlement could still treat all of them as part of the same working world. That flexibility fits a modest iron economy. Small jobs could exist without a hard division of labor, and repair often thrives in places where crafts touch one another. The workshop therefore belonged to a crowded practical landscape where useful work was shared across space even when each artisan kept a distinct craft identity. Such closeness also made it easier for one trade to borrow habits, tools, and timing from another without blurring every boundary completely. The comparison with coaming makes that overlap easier to picture. There, workshop skills and tool categories could overlap, so ironwork did not always sit in a narrow or perfectly separated lane. A knife, a fitting, a fastener, or another small piece of iron might belong to a shared practical vocabulary rather than to a single craft alone. That same kind of overlap helps explain how a modest settlement could sustain repair without a large, specialized industrial district. The smith's work could cross paths with other artisans, and the surrounding community could recognize several useful skills at once. The result was a practical web of labor in which iron repair was one service among others, not an isolated performance. This social arrangement also fits the limited scale of the waste. When debris is slight, the work points toward maintenance and small interventions, not mass output. Even then, the craft remains important because it keeps ordinary objects alive in circulation. A gate piece, a blade, a latch, or a cart fitting could pass through the same working environment and return ready for use. That kind of shared competence gave the settlement resilience. The people around the forge did not need a grand production quarter to keep their tools working. They needed a compact craft world in which one trade touched another and repair stayed close to daily life. In that kind of setting, overlap did not erase skill. It made practical skill easier to sustain. It also kept repair tied to ordinary movement through the settlement. Taken together, these features describe a workshop rooted in use, not spectacle. The smith did not need to command a broad production landscape to matter, because the settlement already depended on keeping iron serviceable. Material waste showed that work took place, yet the traces remained modest enough to suit a craft of upkeep rather than abundance. Iron could arrive through trade links, be shaped or reshaped in place, and return to circulation in the same community that relied on it. That sequence kept the workshop connected to a larger network while preserving its local purpose. The village therefore held on to its tools with less disruption, and the smith's labor became part of the ordinary continuity of rural life. London and Norwich together show that craft concentration varied with setting, while Kopang shows how skills and tool categories could overlap in a shared working area. Those examples do not turn the countryside into a city. They simply show that modest ironsmithing had room to exist in different environments. In the settlement, the result was quiet but durable. Useful things stayed useful, worn metal found a second life, and the community avoided treating every bend or break as the end of service. That is the plain force of the craft here. Not expansion, but maintenance, not display, but continuation, not distance from daily life, but a steady place within it. By the time the work settles into this pattern, the repair has become part of the day's ordinary order, ready for whatever small task comes next. At the edge of a settlement, a small scatter of debris fits repair work better than a large production complex. That kind of footprint belongs to a smith who keeps familiar tools in service, rather than to a place built for constant output. A smithy set within the settlement could still reach a very small repair radius, enough for the needs of nearby households, workshops, and carts, without drawing in a wider trade. In that setting, the forge was part of ordinary town life, not a separate machine for mass goods. Its scale stayed modest, and its purpose stayed practical. You can picture a place where worn edges were taken back to shape, where bent metal was brought to a usable form, and where the day likely centered on keeping things working rather than on making new goods from nothing. The important point is not size for its own sake. It is the fit between a small working area and the ordinary demands of a nearby community which makes repair the natural reading for the space and the debris around it. A broken hook, a loosened hinge, or a tired blade mattered more here than a parade of standard parts, because daily use broke things in many small ways. In a village setting, that practical reach is enough to explain why the same hearth could serve repair after repair without becoming a full-scale workshop of the sort that dominated larger towns. The scale is small, local, and workaday. Hammer scale and slag mark iron shaping, but they do not assign one returned tool to a named owner. They simply show that iron was heated, struck, and cleaned up in a working place that expected repeated use. That is enough to place repair at the center of the forge. A smith could serve practical ironwork without advertising a fixed product line, and that flexibility matters in a settlement where demand changed from week to week. The same hearth that set one piece back in order could turn to another small task when needed, because a village smith did not have to specialize in one narrow output. Straightening, refitting, and sharpening all fit comfortably inside the same small trade. The floor may have held traces of many brief jobs, yet the room itself still belonged to repair. In such a place, the value of the craft lay in keeping things serviceable, not in turning out a uniform stock. That makes the debris scatter and the iron waste red together. They show steady work at a modest scale, with no need to imagine a workshop organized around one product, one buyer, or one repeating line of goods. The forge was practical before it was anything else, and that practicality is the strongest clue in the room. Even when the residue is modest, it still points toward work that served ordinary hands and everyday transport. That is the kind of iron labor a settlement could use without becoming a specialized manufacturing center. A smithy inside a settlement could still serve a very small repair radius, and that small reach helps explain how useful the craft was to daily life. For nearby users, the benefit was not a grand market network, but simple access to a steady fix for worn iron. A hinge, a clasp, a blade, or a fitting did not need to travel far before it could be put back into service. That closeness tied the forge to ordinary rhythms of movement and upkeep, where carts, doors, and tools all depended on modest, repeated attention. The workshop, therefore, belonged to the settlement as a piece of working infrastructure. It supported keeping things in use, which is different from supplying a broad trade in identical goods. A village smith in that position could remain important without becoming large, because the value of the place came from proximity as much as from skill. The radius was small, yet the consequence was broad enough to matter across the community. Repairs made nearby meant less delay, less discard, and less pressure to replace what could be restored. That kind of usefulness does not announce itself loudly, but it shapes how a settlement handles wear, breakdown, and recovery. A place that can mend quickly can keep more of its working life intact, and that is a quiet form of strength. In that sense, the forge was part of the settlement's daily balance, keeping ordinary objects ready for use instead of letting wear decide the pace. Broader craft history from Oxford shows regulation changing over time, and that keeps one town rule from standing in for every smith. Rules could tighten, loosen, or shift with local conditions, so a working craft was never frozen in one legal shape. That matters when reading a village smithy. The local shop did not need to match a town guild pattern in order to function as repair space. Instead, it could answer to a looser and more practical arrangement, one shaped by nearby needs and by whatever customs governed access to the trade. The craft was therefore both ordinary and adaptable. In some places, order came from more formal expectations, in others from habit, reputation, and the simple fact that someone nearby knew how to mend iron. A settlement workshop sat inside that wider world without being ruled by it in every detail. So the presence of repair work does not invite a single tidy story about how smiths always operated. It points to a craft that could live under different forms of oversight while still doing the same everyday labor. That is why a local smithy can be read as part of a changing civic landscape, not as a miniature copy of any one town's regulations. The point is variation, not uniformity, and that variation left room for practical work to continue. A village smith could fit inside that shifting order without ceasing to be local, and the work itself remained the clearest measure of the shop's place. Entry into the craft was not one open road, and apprenticeship and freedom created different paths into a smith's world. That difference shaped who could learn, who could work under another master, and who might arrive at the trade by a less formal route. In a settlement setting, that matters because repair skills had to survive beyond a single household or a single name. Some people would come in through training, others through established standing, and the result was a craft community with more than one doorway. A cautious comparison with early modern apprenticeship is enough to suggest the broad shape of that difference without forcing the medieval village into a later pattern. The point is simple enough: learning the craft could be bounded and orderly, yet not everyone entered by the same gate. That variety helped explain how a small repair shop could remain useful across time. It could draw on different kinds of labor and different forms of trust, while still preserving the skill needed to mend iron close to home. In practical terms, the workshop was not just a place where objects changed shape, it was also a place where knowledge moved, sometimes formally and sometimes through looser access. That made the craft sturdier than a single line of succession would have been. A working settlement needed that flexibility, because repair work depended on both skill and the social arrangements that allowed skill to continue. Different entries kept the craft from closing itself off entirely. That mattered in a village. Seen this way, the repair side of the forge is not a fixed sequence of jobs, but maintenance work answering whatever had worn out. A village smith could meet that need within a small radius, drawing on a place that stayed practical, adaptable, and close at hand. Hammer scale and slag belong to that pattern, as do the modest traces left by work that kept iron in circulation instead of sending it away in a steady stream of finished goods. The settlement did not require a grand system to keep tools usable. It needed a craft that could respond to ordinary wear and return useful things to service. Craft regulation, local custom, and different paths into learning all sat behind that flexibility, but none of them forced the same shape everywhere. What mattered was the ability to mend rather than replace, and to do it in a workshop woven into everyday life. That is why the repair work of the forge belongs to the larger movement of the night. It begins with broken things near hand, and it leads naturally toward the broader range of iron that a community relies on as the work continues. The next demands on the hearth are already implicit in the one nearby, because a smith who can restore tools can also answer other practical needs as they appear. In that steady movement, the workshop keeps the settlement prepared, and the story can turn from restoration toward the wider uses of iron without breaking its calm. At number 1, poultry. Medieval urban craft waste preserves traces of smithing, though not the exact product. The remaining debris is modest, and that modesty suits small local work rather than a larger production system. In a crowded town, a smith could stay busy without commanding a broad yard or a heavy workforce. Broken fragments, tiny scraps, and the plain residue of heat were enough to mark a place where worn iron came back into use. That is the right scale for a repair bench serving nearby households and workshops. It also fits the way town life depended on keeping existing things serviceable. A bent fitting, a dull edge, or a tired clasp did not need ceremony. It needed attention, and then a return to duty. The workshop therefore belonged to maintenance more than display. Its value rested in continuity, in the quiet habit of making useful things useful again. Such a shop would have answered ordinary demands in small, repeated measures, one object at a time, without resembling a grand manufacturing center. The urban setting matters because repair work thrives where customers are close and needs are regular. There is no need for a far-flung system when neighborhood circulation can keep the forge occupied. The town itself provides enough traffic in damaged iron to sustain the craft. In that setting, the forge becomes a practical corner of urban life, modest in scale, yet steady in purpose, a restrained and durable presence for the people around it, day after day, in ordinary use. Inside the workshop, the practical furniture matters as much as the scraps outside. Bellows and anvils fit a repair setting, even though the arrangement changes from place to place. That variation keeps any single floor plan from becoming a rule. One forge may be tucked into one kind of room, another into a different one, yet both can serve the same everyday labor. Chaim Ferraz adds a useful parallel by identifying ironsmithing debris, while also warning against reading one deposit too far. The warning suits this kind of work, because repair spaces often survive in fragments rather than in complete form. A floor can hold scattered traces without preserving every decision made within it. Even so, the basic setting remains recognizable. Bellows drive the fire, the anvil gives shape to the metal, and the room becomes a place where worn objects are returned to service. The point is the working pattern, not a fixed template. A repair forge can use a street room, a side space, or some other practical arrangement, so long as the tools and the labor meet there. That flexibility belongs to town craft life. It keeps the forge responsive to the building that houses it and to the kind of work expected there. The result is a workshop that feels less like a monument than a usable corner of urban routine, shaped by necessity and adaptable enough to persist through seasons of use and the steady pressure of local repair in an inhabited town. Once the forge is understood as adaptable, the range of repairs widens with it. Tool fragments alone do not fix narrow boundaries between repair tasks. A file, a blade, a broken fastening, or a worn fitting can all belong to the same working space, because the smith responds to what can be straightened, sharpened, trimmed, or refashioned. The boundary is practical rather than neat. That is why the repair forge sits near several trades at once, answering need instead of following a rigid list. Trade routes could carry iron into the smithy, so repair work did not depend on a smelting site next door. Metal could arrive through the same channels that supplied other urban needs, and the workshop could keep working without a furnace beside it. That arrangement suits a town built on circulation. Iron enters, damaged pieces leave, and the smith handles the middle ground where wear becomes serviceable again. In that sense, the forge depends on the town's connections rather than on one self-contained chain of production. The work remains local, but its materials travel. A complete industrial neighborhood is not required to keep a repair bench active. A town, a route, and a craft corner are enough. The shop therefore stands inside a larger exchange system while still meeting immediate demands, and the ordinary repair of iron keeps the town's working life from stalling. The result is practical, unshowy, and deeply tied to movement through the settlement and the flow of goods through the town. That local service belongs to the town itself, not to a rural transport forge carrying iron through the countryside. Urban craft concentration keeps the smith within the town's daily life. Customers and makers live close enough that repair work settles into the ordinary grain of the streets. The forge becomes less a remote workshop than a civic convenience, folded into the circulation of broken and usable things. This is where the urban setting matters most. Concentrated craft activity gives the smith a steady reason to exist even when no large commission is underway. Small jobs gather one after another, and each one keeps the workshop attached to the life around it. The picture is one of settlement rather than isolation. The craft does not drift to the margins of the map. It remains within the town's own practical center. That matters because repair often succeeds so quietly that it is easy to overlook. A bent tool returned to use leaves no grand trace, only continued working order. The smith therefore serves the urban household and workshop network without needing to advertise a broad output. The town absorbs the service, and the forge answers in kind. In that balance, the building belongs more to the neighborhood than to any highway economy, and its value lies in proximity, repeat business, and quick adaptation to local wear. Such concentration makes a smithy feel ordinary in the strongest sense, present, reliable, and bound to the place that sustains it through daily use still. What survives points to a local service forge, not to a full list of every broken tool. The shop could mend what arrived and then move on, leaving no reason to preserve the whole stream of daily wear. Its work was open-ended rather than narrow. A sharpened edge, a straightened ring, a tightened fastening, or a refit part could all pass through the same practical hands. The smith's skill was defined by what could be made sound again. That breadth matters because a town depends on quick repairs as much as on new making. The forge therefore handled ordinary interruptions before they became larger troubles. A dependable workshop reduced the friction of daily work. In that sense, the social value of the smith lay in continuity. Tools that keep returning to use keep workshops, households, and small businesses moving. Repair is easy to miss because it restores the normal rather than announcing itself. Yet the normal is exactly what a town needs to hold together. The forge supplied a place where worn iron could be addressed without delay and without ceremony. It also kept repair from being split into neat, separate boxes. The same room could answer to several kinds of need because the town's broken things arrived in mixed form. The result is a practical openness. Instead of a strict inventory, there is a steady habit of restoration, and that habit supports the broader rhythm of urban labor in ordinary streets and the workrooms clustered around them nearby. Taken together, these small traces describe a forge that stayed close to the ordinary needs of town life. The work was local, adaptable, and rooted in repair rather than in spectacle. It did not need a complete inventory of broken things to prove its usefulness. A town could rely on such a place for the kind of ironwork that keeps daily business from fraying at the edges, that makes the workshop part of civic habit as much as craft skill. Urban concentration, ready materials, and a flexible room for labor all belong to the same practical world. The smith served that world by taking damaged metal and returning it to use in forms that could continue in circulation. There is dignity in that scale. It is modest, but it is not minor. A community with a reliable repair forge has a way to absorb wear without letting wear decide the pace of life. That is why the workshop matters even when its footprint remains small. It binds together the town's movement, its exchange of goods, and its confidence that worn things can be made serviceable again. The larger story stays grounded in that habit. Before anything grand can be made, the everyday needs of the place have to keep working. In this quarter of the craft, the answer is not abundance, but steadiness, and the forge gives exactly that, one repaired piece at a time. Its quiet labor leaves the town ready for another round of use once more. At the village forge, repair work begins with ordinary damage rather than grand forging. Practical ironwork could be heated and shaped again without naming a particular object or sequence. That kind of work sat inside a craft world that was never perfectly frozen in place. Oxford's craft history shows admission and freedom changing across time, which means a smith's standing could shift with the rules of the town and the path of the worker. Apprenticeship and membership could lead to varied prospects as institutions changed. Apprenticeship belonged to this world too, as organized learning inside the trade, but the people who entered it did not all begin from the same household, and they did not all end in the same position. Some would stay close to manual service, while others could step toward fuller recognition. In a rural forge, those larger patterns still matter, even when the work itself looks small. A repaired tool, once returned to use, carries that whole social range quietly with it, because the iron is never merely iron. It sits inside a life of service, status, and exchange that changes as surely as the shape under the hammer. In the port city, rules for admission and freedom could harden or loosen, yet that shifting pattern did not make the forge fixed, only more legible as a place where rank and skill could separate. The repaired tools matter because a smith's standing has to be read from written traces, not from scraps of iron alone. A heap of scale, offcuts, and hammered fragments can show that ironwork took place, but it cannot tell you whether the worker was free, apprenticed, newly admitted, or long established. That is a careful but useful distinction, because the remains of work are often louder than the person who made them. In a village setting, that silence is especially strong. The forge floor may preserve the practical result of a task, yet the person behind the task stays named only in written traces. A completed repair leaves the iron back in circulation, ready to serve another day in a hinge, a latch, a tool head, or a cart fitting, and the waste beside it simply marks that the job was finished. It does not speak a rank, it does not speak a household, it does not settle whether the smith stood inside a craft community, at its edge, or across from it on an ordinary business footing. The late medieval setting keeps that boundary visible. Early modern apprenticeship can help explain the broad shape of organized learning, but only if its differences are kept in view and not pressed too hard onto another period. So the small pile of debris marks completion. Iron was worked here, repaired here, and sent back into use here. That keeps the worker unnamed, and the metal in motion through service. Early modern apprenticeship gives a familiar model, a set arrangement, a master, years of training, a place inside craft life, but the later form should stay beside the late medieval world as comparison, not replacement. In the older countryside and town, a young worker could still enter organized learning without sharing the same origins as the next one. Some came from households already tied to trade, some likely did not. Some would remain close to the forge, while others could carry the skill into a different future. No single term governed every smith's training, and that matters because craft learning was structured yet not uniform. The path was real, but it was not one straight lane. A boy or young man entering service to a smith might learn how metal answers heat, how to judge a repair, how to keep tools moving through daily use, and how to follow the habits of a shop. Yet the social meaning of that learning could vary widely, from modest household support to a route toward recognized craft status. Oxford's changing rules for admission and freedom help keep that flexibility in sight. They show that membership could be managed, adjusted, and rethought over time, rather than fixed once and for all. In a rural forge, that means skill, access, and standing should never be collapsed into a single story. The same apprentice-like training could lead to different lives, and the same craft could hold men of different rank within its orbit, or leave them unchanged. City regulation offers a useful comparison because it shows how craft life could be ordered on paper. Admission, freedom, and the privileges attached to membership could be tracked, recorded, and controlled in ways that made the craft more legible to officials and neighbors alike. Yet that picture belongs to a town. It cannot be stretched into a rule for a village forge, where the work of keeping iron serviceable mattered more than the tidy reach of civic oversight. A rural smith still belonged to a wider craft world, but the local setting made his role less likely to look fixed. The same man might repair tools for neighbors, work under looser arrangements, or move between states of recognition as practice and custom shifted. That is why Oxford's changing craft history matters here. It reminds us that admission and freedom were not timeless constants. Even in a place with strong institutions, they changed across time, and so a smith's standing could change too. A comparison with early modern apprenticeship helps only in the same restrained way. The later world shows that organized learning could be formal and durable, but it also warns against imagining one hard template for every period. No single term fits every smith's apprenticeship, and no civic rule from a town should be treated as the measure of a village worker. In the countryside, repair work could stay practical, local, and socially varied all at once, with status following use rather than regulation in quiet service. The repair story ends not with a showpiece, but with iron staying in circulation through ordinary service. That is the real rhythm of a village forge. Most work there did not create something new from nothing. It kept older objects useful, returned worn metal to duty, and stretched the life of common equipment. A hinge could keep a door working, a blade could keep cutting, and a fitting could keep a cart or harness in order because someone knew how to reshape damaged iron. In that sense, repair was not a side task. It was the craft's everyday center. The waste left behind mattered only insofar as it showed that the job had been done and the tool had gone back into use. The standing of the smith came from that service and from the wider rules of craft life, not from the debris itself. Apprenticeship and admission could give a clearer place inside the trade, yet the practical result stayed the same. Iron remained available to the community. That is why social rank and material usefulness cannot be separated too neatly here. The worker could be a recognized craft figure, a man moving toward that place, or someone whose position was still changing. But the repaired metal followed its own simpler path. It rejoined daily work. It stayed in circulation. It made possible the next small task, and then the one after that, in a world where continuity mattered more than display. Such repairs also hint at the patience of the rural economy. By the close of this repair work, the important thing is not a dramatic finish, but continued usefulness. Iron has gone back to the life it already had, and the village has kept what it owned in service. That ordinary result fits the larger social pattern around the forge. The repaired metal returned to use, and the forge's day moved with it. The debris on the floor told only that iron had been worked and finished. The useful meaning lay in the return, not in the scraps. A village forge could be part of a wider craft world, while still feeling local, practical, and limited to serviceable things. Repair was maintenance, and return, a steady answer to damage. It left behind neither fanfare nor certainty beyond the fact that damaged iron was made fit again. In that quiet continuity, the section reaches its own end and leaves the next work waiting in the same unhurried way. A latch holds, a blade cuts, a fitting steadies, and the village keeps moving without ceremony. That is what repair made possible: fewer replacements, less loss, and more days from the same material. In that practical economy, even worn iron mattered after the hammer fell, because its value lived on in use. The section ends where the work naturally ends, with metal ready to serve again. From there, the night can carry on in silence, with no need for spectacle, only the ordinary knowledge that broken things have been set right for the moment. Repair extended useful life and kept ordinary ironwork in circulation within the village economy. At Market Bosworth, small-scale repair production is linked with horseshoeing in pre-industrial smithies, and that pairing gives the workshop its first clear shape. The forge does not stand apart from everyday needs, it answers them together. A broken tool, a worn fitting, and a horse that needs iron work belong to the same world of service. What matters is not a grand division between crafts, but the way one small place can gather several useful tasks under one roof. In that setting, the smithy keeps repair and making close to each other, because one often leads into the other. A village did not need a separate house for every kind of iron problem. It needed a working place where those problems could be met as they came. Horseshoeing therefore sits inside the business of the forge rather than at its edge. Market Bosworth makes that relation clear. It shows how iron service could remain local, limited in scale, and still broad enough to handle the pressures of field, road, and household. Repair was not an afterthought, and production was not an isolated ambition. They met in the same measured labor, so the smith could turn from mending to making without changing the character of the place. That is why the link to horseshoeing matters. It belongs to the same rhythm of iron service, where usefulness comes first and the craft remains close to the settlement it serves. The workshop stands not for display, but for the steady way it kept useful things in use. A smithy of this kind was useful because it was not narrowed to a single audience. It could serve horses alongside domestic, commercial, and agricultural ironwork, meeting household life, trade, and fieldwork in one place. That mixture kept the forge rooted in the settlement's routine. A pot hook, a cart fitting, a strap repair, or a horseshoe all belonged to the same practical register, even when the objects differed. The ironworker answered what had to be fixed, fitted, or renewed, and the value of the workshop lay in that range. No separate craft universe was required for each demand. One modest shop could absorb several kinds of work without losing its local character. This broad service also explains why horseshoeing belongs here so naturally. The horse was important, but not apart from everything else. Its care sat beside the upkeep of things that moved goods, supported households, and kept the land in use. The workshop mattered because it remained flexible rather than specialized in a narrow sense. That flexibility is the historical pattern. A settlement could rely on one practical place because that place could take many forms of iron trouble and make them usable again. The smithy therefore appears as a shared resource, not an elite chamber of craft distinction. It stayed ordinary, and that ordinariness made it dependable. In a small community, dependability was quiet strength, and the forge offered it through breadth of service rather than display. Its work joined animal care, household upkeep, and agricultural use without ceremony. One later example places forge bellows, an anvil, storage space, a yard, and nearby water in the same arrangement. Read together, those features suggest a compact workshop where heat, heavy striking, storage, and access to water supported one another. Bellows fed the fire, the anvil took the blows, storage kept material within reach, the yard provided working room, and water stood close enough for practical use. The value of that layout lies in its plain efficiency. It shows how a small forge could be organized for repeated service without becoming large or elaborate. Even so, the arrangement should stay in its proper place. It is one example, not a universal medieval plan. Many village smiths would have worked in smaller or differently ordered spaces, and the important point is only that such a grouping makes sense of how a workshop could hold repair and making together. The forge did not need grand architecture to be useful. It needed enough order for the tools, the material, and the work to meet one another without waste. That practical arrangement keeps the scene grounded. It is not a general pattern, and it is not a universal blueprint. It is a workable setting for iron service, one that makes room for the repeated, familiar tasks that define the smithy. In that sense, the layout is less about spectacle than about convenience, and convenience is exactly what allows a small craft place to endure. Such order lets a small shop answer several needs at once. Because the workshop stays compact, repair and production can sit together without splitting into separate enterprises. That is the practical value of the setting. It lets repair and production coexist on a small scale, so the smithy can answer immediate problems while still making what those problems require. A worn edge, a broken fitting, or a horse in need of iron work does not have to travel into another world of labor. It stays within a modest system of service, and that modesty is the historical point. The smith is not working in a narrow role. The work is measured in usefulness, not in volume, and the same place can move between maintenance and making, because its scale allows that movement. Smallness here does not mean limitation alone. It means that different kinds of labor can share one practical setting without losing their local character. The forge becomes a hinge between keeping and creating. That is why the overlap matters more than any single object. A workshop shaped this way can answer what the settlement presents, then turn the answer into another piece of useful iron. The result is steady rather than dramatic, but it is steady in a way that keeps the community going. The same local place can mend, fit, and produce, and that combination is enough to make the smithy indispensable. It is a setting built for continuous usefulness, not for spectacle. There is no hard boundary between fixing what exists and shaping what is needed next. Horseshoeing becomes clearer when it is not treated as a separate craft universe. Here it sits inside ordinary iron service, alongside the broader business of repair and upkeep, so the horse is part of the same practical field as the household implement and the cart fitting. That is what the Market Bosworth link makes plain. Horsework joins the same small-scale pattern that keeps domestic, commercial, and agricultural ironwork moving. The smithy is therefore not a special station for one class of customer. It is a shared place where different kinds of use meet the same skill. A village could rely on one working place without dividing life into sealed categories, and the forge answered that need by staying adaptable. Adaptation is not an extra feature in such a setting. It is the whole reason the shop matters. The horse remains important, but it is one demand among others, and the smithy's place in local life comes from answering all of them within one ordinary framework. The arrangement also keeps social relationships plain. People brought different kinds of need to the same practical setting, and that common dependency gave the shop its quiet standing. It was useful because it did not isolate animal care from household work or field equipment. It kept them connected, and that connection is the historical shape worth remembering. Nothing about the arrangement requires a separate craft identity for horsework, because the whole point is the shared rhythm of use that ties the workshop to the settlement. So the scene settles into a simple historical pattern. The smithy is small, mixed, and practical. Repair, production, and horseshoeing belong together, and the layout, when described, is best understood as one later arrangement rather than a universal plan. That is enough to show how the work moved. The account points to service, not to large-scale output, and it should not be stretched into a precise daily schedule. What it offers instead is a grounded picture of a workshop that can keep several kinds of ironwork in play at once. One place, a few tools, different demands, and a craft answer that stays close to ordinary life. In that sense, the forge keeps repair, making, and horseshoeing within the same human scale, and then leaves the larger order of the settlement to carry them onward. The important thing is restraint. The village smith does not need a separate identity for every task. The same workshop can keep many forms of iron service alive, and that flexibility is the quiet end of the story here. It leaves a clear image of craft without pretending to a timetable or a grander system. The work remains local, practical, and ordinary, which is exactly why it matters in a settlement built on use and repetition. Its value lies in continuity, not scale, and in the fact that repair and production can meet before a need drifts elsewhere. That steady overlap is enough for a village forge, and it is enough for the quiet business of horses and carts. In this workshop, iron service reaches beyond the narrow boundaries of one trade. Agricultural ironwork belongs among the broad duties a smithy could handle, and that place in the work matters because domestic, commercial, and farm jobs often met under the same roof. Hinges for a house, fittings for trade, and pieces for the fields were all part of the same practical world. The smith did not need a separate room for each class of customer because the labor was usually adjustment, refitting, and replacement. That is why the forge reads as a place of continual mending rather than a place devoted to large, specialized manufacture. Its value lay in range. Household iron, market iron, and farming iron could all pass through the same fire and the same hands without changing the workshop into something else. In that sense, the smithy belonged to daily maintenance as much as to craft. It stood inside a mixed economy where work for home and work for profit touched one another closely. The broad service field should stay broad, since the point is not one narrow product, but a reliable capacity to answer many ordinary needs. Horses, carts, and field gear all belonged within that same practical service world, and the shop's first identity was to keep them in use. The same workplace could meet many kinds of demand without losing its character, and that flexibility made it central to ordinary repair. That practical reach helped the forge stay central even when exact tasks shifted. Within that same field, cart fittings and horse-related repairs fit naturally, but only as parts of the wider service a smith could offer. A broken strap fitting, a worn iron band, or a damaged attachment belonged to repair work, not to a separate world of carriage making. That distinction matters because it keeps the forge from being mistaken for a specialist yard set aside for one line of goods. This pattern points to small-scale repair production where pieces were shaped, corrected, and returned to use in modest numbers. Such work favored prompt fixing over long runs of identical items. It also kept different kinds of transport equipment close together in the same practical setting. Horses, carts, and farm gear all belonged within that shared iron service field, since each depended on fastening, reinforcement, or adjustment. The workshop did not need to be narrowed to one named product in order to make sense. Its purpose was broader than any single fitting or vehicle part. A smith who could answer varied calls for help was more useful than a maker tied to a single output. That is why the category should remain open. It includes transport, farm use, and household need without dividing them into separate trades. The work was steady, practical, and local, guided by repair rather than display or scale. In that way, the forge served movement itself, keeping equipment in circulation with minimal interruption. That breadth mattered in villages and towns alike, where a broken fitting could halt movement. The scale of the work points to another important feature. Small-scale repair production fits the picture better than a large specialist yard, because the available tasks were varied, occasional, and often closely related to one another. A place built for many little remedies needed room to sort, hold, and return pieces without committing to mass output. That scale also suits a smithy where domestic, commercial, and farm ironwork overlap in the same working place. The same fire, the same bench, and the same hands could take on a household hinge, a trading fitting, or a field tool without requiring separate departments. This mixed pattern gives the forge its ordinary strength. It was less a factory than a local repair center shaped by constant adjustment. The fact that agricultural ironwork appears in the broad service categories only confirms that wider reach. The shop's identity rested on being able to handle several kinds of iron need in one stream of labor. That does not make the work vague. It makes it adaptable. In practice, adaptability meant that the same setting could absorb different sizes of task without losing order or purpose. Such a place fit the needs of a community that depended on quick restoration more than on grand making. The smith's value lay in keeping objects useful, not in producing them in abundance. That is the proper measure of the workshop's role, and it keeps the picture tied to repair, service, and circulation. Order came from repetition of judgment, not from volume. Space inside and around the workshop mattered because repair work needed a place for items at different stages. storage and yard space helped keep raw metal, finished pieces, and objects waiting for attention from crowding one another. That practical arrangement made it easier to manage a varied stream of jobs without turning the smithy into a rigidly defined layout. It also explains why the building could handle mixed repairs at close quarters. A cart piece, a horse fitting, and a farm implement might each require a different treatment, yet all could pass through the same working place. The important point is utility, not a fixed plan shared by every medieval smithy. Workshop features like storage and yard space matter, but they do not prove a universal medieval layout. They show that enough room for sorting and handling was useful in a trade centered on flexibility. The yard therefore belonged to the shop's working intelligence. It kept awkward pieces from blocking the hearth and gave the smith a place to set aside stock or completed fittings. That kind of order suited a place where repair mattered more than display. It supported circulation, letting objects move from waiting to working to ready again. In that sense, the physical setting and the service pattern belonged together. A workshop with room to breathe could sustain a wider range of iron tasks without confusion. The space itself did not define one universal medieval shape, but it did serve a practical pattern of maintenance. That practical depth fits the setting. The same broad service range also carried social meaning. A forge that answered many ordinary calls became part of settlement life in a direct and dependable way. It could serve the household needing a fitting put right, the trader whose equipment required repair, and the farm that relied on sound iron through the season. That reach made the smith useful across boundaries that were often close together in daily life. Domestic and commercial ironwork overlapped in the same working place, so the workshop linked different kinds of use instead of separating them. The broad service field should not be narrowed to one named product, because the real strength of the smithy was range. A place able to handle many small tasks was more valuable than one framed around a single special output. Cart fittings, horse-related repairs, and farm gear all belonged within that same practical field, and that flexibility helped keep tools and transport in circulation. Such work was not dramatic, but it was necessary. It maintained the everyday connections that let work continue without interruption. The smith's role was therefore both technical and social, because repair supported the common rhythm of use. In a small community, that kind of service mattered as much as any larger craft. It tied home, market, and field together through steady ironwork. The workshop's importance came from being present and adaptable, a trusted point of repair in ordinary life. That ordinary usefulness gave the forge a lasting place in local habits of dependence. For shape, a later 19th century layout at Market Bosworth can be used as comparison only. It shows one way a forge might organize hearth, working ground, and nearby storage, but it does not turn the earlier workshop into the same arrangement. The comparison is useful because it clarifies function without claiming identity. It keeps attention on the practical need for access, sorting, and room to handle mixed repairs. That matters for a place where small-scale repair production fits better than a large specialist yard. The earlier smithy still belongs to a broader service world in which domestic, commercial, and farm ironwork overlapped. Agricultural ironwork sits within that same pattern, and cart fittings or horse-related repairs fit there only as parts of a wider field of use. The point remains range, not one named product. Horses, carts, and farm gear all belong to the same practical iron service, and the workshop's usefulness came from meeting them without narrowing its task. Storage and yard space helped, but they do not define a single universal medieval plan. They simply show how a working place could stay orderly while remaining flexible. That flexible order is the best way to understand the forge here. It kept repair moving, kept different tasks within reach, and kept the shop centered on service. By the end of the section, the workshop appears less like a special building for one trade and more like a local system of maintenance, ready for many ordinary demands. That was enough for the day and the work ahead. Later medieval ironworking did not follow a single pattern. In some places, water-powered development became part of the craft, while in others, the smith worked in an ordinary shop with no stream-driven arrangement at all. That difference matters because ironworking across England was never evenly organized. In the Wealden district, furnaces, forges, and streams belonged together in a specialized regional setting, each part supporting the others within a wider iron country. West Sussex should stay separate from that world. There, ironworking belonged to everyday settlement smithing, the kind of work folded into local service rather than into a whole production landscape. Water sometimes mattered, but not in one universal way across the country, and that unevenness shaped how far a smith's work reached beyond the shop. The useful distinction is between a regional system built around production and a local craft built around repair and maintenance. Both relied on iron and skill, but they answered different needs. One sat inside a landscape of heavy working. The other sat among the routine demands of nearby fields, roads, and households. Keeping those settings apart gives the craft its proper scale, because the same skill could support very different worlds without becoming the same thing. The ordinary workshop remained part of daily life, not because it lacked importance, but because its value lay in service rather than in mass output. That is why the setting must be read as service first, manufacture second, with its practical reach measured by upkeep rather than by visible scale. On that ordinary side of the craft, the building itself did not need to sit beside a smelting district. Horseshoe and cart repair could take place in a place close to roads, fields, and the daily traffic of work without any furnace complex nearby. That is why the West Sussex setting remains distinct from the Wealden Iron District. The smith did not need ore, bloomery debris, or a chain of furnace sites in order to mend iron that kept movement and cultivation going. A working shop could stay small and local while still answering to broader needs around it. In that sense, the forge served as a practical hinge between land and road. It kept fittings serviceable and wagons ready for use through repair rather than through smelting. The absence of a smelting landscape beside the shop is part of the story because it shows that iron service could be separated from iron making. The community could depend on the craft for many needs without turning the place into a production landscape. The result was a modest metalworking presence, close enough to matter and ordinary enough to blend into settlement life. Its usefulness came from being placed among routine paths of work, where damaged iron could return to service without drawing the countryside into the geography of production. Local repair mattered precisely because it kept movement close at hand, and because it could answer ordinary need without reorganizing the whole surrounding countryside around furnaces, fuel, or heavy production sites there. Small remains around a repair bench can show the kind of work that kept such a place busy. Offcuts, fragments, and worn scraps point to repeated attention to iron that had already served somewhere else. They do not need to name the vehicle or animal served, and they do not need to suggest a shop full of matching stock. Instead, they indicate a place where damaged fittings were reshaped, tightened, or replaced as needed. The useful measure here is capacity. A smithy could answer many calls without keeping a fixed store of every iron piece it might ever touch. That matters because service work is flexible in a way manufacture is not. A bench for repair can reflect changing demand from roads, fields, and households around it, while leaving no neat inventory of the objects repaired there. Even so, the traces of waste tell a clear story. This was a working center of maintenance, not a warehouse of standard goods. In a settled countryside, that flexibility would have been valuable, because it let iron remain in circulation longer and kept useful equipment from being discarded too soon. Such waste also suggests repeated visits rather than a single burst of work. The shop's value lay in returning worn iron to service again and again. That makes the bench legible as ongoing support for local work, where usefulness was measured in small returns to service, not in the presence of a stock of finished goods or a fixed list of forms there. The smith's role could stretch across transport and farm needs together, even when no single product signature remained to define the shop. A smith might mend a cart fitting one day and address a farm implement another, not because the work belonged to different trades, but because repair linked them. The main aim was to keep iron serviceable, whatever object came to hand. That breadth helps explain why such places mattered socially as well as technically. They stood where movement, cultivation, and ordinary maintenance met, helping the countryside continue its routines without interruption. Water could matter in different ways across England, yet it never fixed one universal pattern. Some workshops were shaped by streams and powered processes, others depended on settlement life and the steady circulation of repair. The social reach of a smithy came from that versatility. It allowed a community to rely on practical knowledge rather than on a narrow product line. The boundary between transport and farming mattered less than the need to keep both working. A single shop could therefore serve many household needs without ever advertising itself through a standardized stock. That wide usefulness is part of the ordinary medieval craft, where service mattered more than display, and where the same hammerwork answered several kinds of local demand. Such versatility gave the shop a steady local value, because neighbors did not need separate places for every small iron repair, only a dependable smith who could keep several kinds of work in circulation nearby continually. The contrast with the Wealden case matters because it shows two different ways iron could sit in the landscape. There, furnaces, forges, and streams formed a specialized regional setting, a linked world of extraction and working iron. Here, the shop belongs to everyday settlement life. The difference is not merely one of scale, it changes what the craft is doing around it. In the specialized district, water and heat helped organize production across a wider terrain. In the village world, the smith's usefulness came from being available where broken iron actually needed attention. The workshop could stay close to the practical center of movement and cultivation without becoming part of a smelting network. That is the larger historical pattern behind a modest repair place. It shows that medieval ironworking was not a single uniform story, but a set of related crafts and settings, each answering different needs. The regional iron district and the ordinary settlement both belonged to the same broader economy, yet they did not function in the same way. Once the distinction is clear, the small forge takes on its proper weight. It becomes less a miniature version of iron production and more a local service point, useful precisely because it was not tied to one heavy production pattern. That meant water was important as a resource, yet not as a rule. The same broad craft could take a different shape in another county, which is why the local setting must stay clear here. That distinction mattered in practice there. By then, the forge's value lies in plain continuity. It keeps worn iron in use, lets transport remain serviceable, and supports farm work without needing a grand production backdrop. That combination gives the shop its place in the longer evening, because the craft here is measured less by what is made from raw ore than by what remains usable after repair. A settlement smith could touch many parts of rural life and still leave no single product defining the whole shop. That is not a weakness in the story, it is the story. The important thing is steadiness, a place where iron can stay in service, where local needs are met without grandeur, and where the broad reach of the craft fits quietly inside ordinary life. The working life of the district, the settlement forge, and the repair bench all belong to the same medieval world, but they occupy different corners of it. That difference is what matters as this part of the night settles into its next concern. This leaves the craft poised in that practical calm, with no need to change its character in order to remain useful. Its work has been local from first to last, and that locality is what gives it shape. What remains is a local order of care, where iron stays serviceable because the smith's knowledge reaches across more than one sort of need, and where continuity matters more than any single finished piece there. That steadiness carries the night onward quietly. By the time the forge comes into view, it belongs to ordinary upkeep as much as to making. A small smithy could keep horses, carts, and field gear in service through steady repair, and that is the scale that matters here. The craft was less a matter of grand production than of saving useful things from early ruin. Bent fittings, loose rims, worn shoes, and broken traces all sit inside the same practical world. You can think of it as the repair habit of a working settlement, where movement across lanes, yards, and fields depends on iron being put right rather than replaced at once. That keeps hauling possible, keeps animals working, and keeps the tools of farming from drifting into scrap. The forge therefore belongs to daily continuity. It is not a showpiece of metalwork standing apart from life, but a place where wear is met with care. In that sense, the workshop sits at the meeting point of transport and agriculture, helping the community hold its pace together without drawing much notice. It also suggests a modest scale of ambition. The aim is not to transform the settlement, only to keep its useful iron from failing before its time. That practical patience is the heart of the scene. Nothing about that work asks for ceremony. It relies on steadiness and on the simple fact that repaired iron lets a community keep moving from one ordinary need to the next without turning every worn fitting into a fresh problem. The floor itself could carry the quiet signs of that work. Slag mixed with hammer scale points to shaping and reheating, the residue of iron struck, turned, and finished in place. That kind of deposit tells you that metal was being worked, yet it leaves the exact object unnamed. A horseshoe, a cart fitting, a strap iron, or some other piece would all leave traces that look much the same once the labor is over. The point is not a tidy catalogue of objects, but a workshop pattern. The smith was not limited to one narrow task, and the building need not have been arranged like a later specialist shop. Broad labels help the story, but they do not produce a full list of finished goods. What survives in the ground fits a place where heating, hammering, and adjustment happened often enough to mark the surface. It is a practical kind of footprint, one that reads as repeated shaping rather than one dramatic event. In a place like that, the ordinary business of keeping iron fit for use becomes the central fact. The marks are enough to show activity that was continuous, useful, and familiar. That is why the floor matters as much as the anvil itself. A few scattered traces can point to repeated use, to work that returned day after day, and to a place where making and mending sat close together rather than apart. The setting feels ordinary, yet it is exactly that ordinariness that gives the forge its shape. That central fact matters because it points to service, not display. The forge fits a place where working animals and carts could be kept in use through ongoing attention, and where the ironwork around them was repaired before it failed completely. A shop like this does not need a long written roster of orders to make sense. It works as a service forge for the moving parts of rural life, not as a place organized around one named line of buyers. The useful things here are the ones that matter when transport, hauling, and fieldwork must go on. A shoe can be reset, a fitting tightened, a worn edge sharpened, and the item returns to work instead of leaving the system. That kind of repair economy keeps delay from spreading. It also reminds you that medieval craft was often about maintenance first and fresh manufacture second. The broad categories tell the story well enough, even if they stop short of a complete product list. What counts is the practical result. Horses, carts, and gear remain serviceable because somebody is ready to work the iron again. The workshop, therefore, sits between the road and the field, answering ordinary need before it becomes crisis. It is a modest economy of use, where iron stays in circulation by being corrected at the edge of failure. That makes the forge less like a place of display than a place of continuity, and that continuity is what gives the settlement its reliable movement. Comparisons from other places help only if they stay in their place. London has a concentration of crafts that is useful as a comparison, but it is not a model that can simply be laid over a rural transport forge. A dense town and a smaller settlement solve different problems, even when both host many kinds of work. Kolpang also warns against forcing one occupation into a single box, because a workshop there shows overlapping skills rather than a rigid split between trades. That is why the task has to stay flexible in description. One space may hold more than one kind of ironwork, and the same hands may move between fitting, repair, and general adjustment. Still, that does not justify turning every workshop into the same kind of place. English medieval settlements remain the better guide for the setting at hand, and later comparison examples should not outweigh them. So the forge stands as part of a local landscape of mixed labor, not as a borrowed copy of a city craft quarter. Its meaning comes from its own setting, where practical repair served the needs of movement without becoming a specialized urban pattern. The comparison is useful only when it stays in the background. That restraint keeps the reading honest. It lets the forge stay rooted in the smaller world it actually belongs to, where practical repair matters more than urban variety, and where one workshop can serve a broad local need without becoming an imported type for this scene alone. Repair also sits easily beside domestic and agricultural demands. The same household or yard could need food prepared, animals tended, and iron set right in the same broad working rhythm. That does not prove one universal sequence for the day, because local life rarely moves in a single line. Instead, it shows a settlement where different kinds of labor can overlap without confusion. A forge like this belongs to that overlap. It is present when carts need attention, but it is also part of a place that must keep itself running in more than one way at once. That matters socially as well as practically. The smithy is not isolated from everyday obligations, and the work does not create a separate world of its own. It serves the routines that surround it, borrowing time from them and giving utility back in return. In that sense, repair is one thread in a wider fabric of work. The workshop does not replace domestic or agricultural life, it joins them. The result is a settlement rhythm, built from several kinds of labor that can happen side by side, each one supporting the others without demanding a single fixed order. That flexibility is part of ordinary medieval life, not an exception to it. It is the kind of arrangement that keeps a place adaptable because work can be shifted. That is a practical social strength, and it suits a smithy that serves many small needs. The pace stays steady because tasks share the same ground. By the close of the day, the forge reads as part of that ordinary rhythm rather than an interruption to it. The important thing is not a dramatic finish, but the way the workshop leaves useful iron ready for another stretch of service. That keeps the picture grounded in place. The smithy answers immediate needs, and it does so without becoming a separate or heroic realm. It remains tied to horses, carts, and field gear, to the shared labor that lets a community keep moving, so the final impression is quiet. Iron is made fit for use, the workshop returns to its place among other tasks, and the settlement carries on with its work intact. The day does not end with a lesson or a flourish. It ends with continuity, which is often the truest sign of useful craft. As one task settles, another can take its turn, and the workshop fades back into the larger working life around it. That is enough to carry the section forward without strain. The forge does not need a louder ending because its whole value lies in persistence rather than spectacle. A place that can mend iron for animals and carts helps the settlement begin again the next day with less interruption. The work is modest, but its reach is wide, and that quiet usefulness is what lingers as the story moves on. The room for repair is also room for later labor, and that practical order is what keeps the day from breaking apart. Apprenticeship was a long-lived system of organized craft learning, and in the smith's trade it marked the passage from dependence toward recognized craft standing. Entry into the trade could be shaped by guilds, by private contracts, or by courts, so the route into a workshop was never governed by one fixed doorway. In Oxford, that craft history changed over time rather than remaining still, and that shifting regulation placed apprenticeship inside a living civic order. The smith's forge, therefore, belonged to more than metalworking. It also belonged to the set of local arrangements that admitted newcomers and recognized their place. Admission and freedom were changing institutional practices, not timeless medieval constants, and they could be tightened, relaxed, or rearranged as the town's habits shifted. A learner moving into the craft entered a relation defined by custom and authority together, with duties on both sides. The result was a training path that was part of the town's public order, not a separate private matter hidden away from it. When a young worker stood within that arrangement, the workshop already reflected the rules by which the town made craft life legible. No apprentice stood outside that order as a mere helper. The craft recognized his place through the same changing rules that marked entry and release, so apprenticeship and civic regulation moved together. That continuity also explains why apprenticeship and closing time belonged to the same civic rhythm, since the making of tools depended on the making of learners there too. Because those channels of entry were varied, apprentices came from different social backgrounds. The craft was not reserved for one uniform sort of family, and that breadth mattered inside the town's wider life. One learner might arrive through a guild arrangement, another through a private bargain, and another under a court-backed settlement, yet all belonged to the same broad system of instruction. Their starting points were different, but the discipline of training drew them into a common craft relation. That variety kept apprenticeship from becoming a closed hereditary path. A craft household, a town family, or a person bound by formal terms could all take part in the same learning structure, even if the social weight of each route differed. The important point is multiplicity, not equality. Guilds could control who entered, private contracts could define obligation, and courts could confirm or adjust the arrangement. Together, those channels made craft entry visible to the town, while also allowing people of differing rank and background to move toward the forge. Apprenticeship therefore joined skill to social sorting without reducing the trade to one class or one inherited standing. That flexibility did not erase hierarchy, but it did prevent the smithy from belonging to one narrow social type. Training could cross lines of kinship and wealth while still leaving rank in place. That broader opening mattered for the social life of the craft, because the route into instruction could widen without erasing the obligations that defined apprenticeship itself for learners alike. Admission and freedom were changing institutional practices, and that change kept the smith's path local and variable. A town could give greater weight to one kind of entry in one period, then shift toward another form later. Oxford's changing craft rules remind us that learning, dependence, and release were not one medieval constant. The route into the forge was shaped by the moment in which it was taken, as well as by the people and offices that recognized it. That is why the apprentice's standing should be read as part of civic order rather than as a timeless badge. The same town could make the route more formal at one stage and less formal at another, and those changes altered how entry into the trade was understood. The learning path was not universal, but local, negotiated, and tied to the institutions that governed craft life at that time. For a smith, that meant the early stage of training depended on where he worked and under what rule. The town's craft order and the workshop's discipline were linked, and the apprentice occupied the space where both met. The result was not a single medieval ladder, but a sequence that shifted with the town's own choices. The learner's place changed as local rules changed, and that made entry into the craft a social arrangement as well as a practical one. Those shifts made the workshop's order a local fact, not fixed. Later organized craft learning, documented after the medieval period, offers only a restricted comparison for earlier smith training. It can show that apprenticeship remained a durable way of learning a trade, but it should not be taken as a template for the medieval forge. Later arrangements generally carried more formal labels and tighter structure than an earlier town would necessarily have used, and that difference matters. It keeps the older world from being flattened into one neat pattern. Earlier learning could be more loosely bound in one place and more closely supervised in another, so the smith's route into skill should be treated with caution and locality in mind. A clean line from learner to master is convenient, yet the historical path was often less tidy. The comparison with the later period works only as a narrow sidelight, useful for orientation and nothing more. It reminds us that organized learning had a long life, while also warning against forcing a single sequence onto every forge. The later world is not the measure of the earlier one. It simply shows that the idea of apprenticeship endured even as its form changed. In an earlier town, the route into the craft was shaped by present institutions, not by some fixed medieval pattern preserved intact across centuries. The later pattern can therefore be read as a sign of durability, not as a mold for earlier practice. It helps place the smith's training in time without pretending that all craft learning ever followed the same shape. Apprenticeship status depended on recognized terms rather than iron debris alone. Admission, a contract, or another recognized term could place a learner within the craft's ordered system. Slag, by contrast, only indicates that iron was worked nearby. It cannot name the person who was being trained, the standing under which he worked, or the terms of his entry. That distinction matters because craft learning was social as well as material. The forge might leave traces of production, but apprenticeship left its own kind of trace in the way the town recognized a learner's place. A smith's learning path therefore belonged to local terms of status, not to workshop debris treated as though it could speak for itself. This is also why the earlier and later forms of organized craft learning must remain separate in thought. The later period can illuminate the broad idea of apprenticeship, yet the medieval smith's place still depends on local and documentary markers. When those markers survive, they show how admission and freedom worked as changing practices rather than eternal ones. Without those terms, the social path remains distinct from the physical remains of ironwork. A written trace could place a learner inside the craft's obligations, while slag left the question of status untouched. That gap is what keeps material remains and apprenticeship from being confused. The boundary stayed clear in practice. Taken together, these patterns show a craft route that was durable yet never universal. Apprenticeship lasted as an organized way of learning, but its entrance points were shaped by guilds, private contracts, and courts, and those forms did not stand still. Oxford's changing craft regulation makes that plain. It also explains why apprentices came from varied social backgrounds instead of one uniform type. Some began through household connections, some through formal terms, and some through civic arrangements, but all entered a disciplined and locally recognized path. Admission and freedom belonged to that changing structure, not to a timeless medieval rule. Even the later, better documented world of organized craft learning can only provide a narrow comparison for the earlier forge, not a universal model. For the smith, the route into skill was therefore local and variable. tied to the institutions of a particular town and period. Documentary signs could mark apprenticeship status, while slag could only show that iron had been worked. That is the practical boundary that keeps the history clear. It preserves the difference between labor at the hearth and learning within the craft. It also leaves the smithy standing as part of a town in which social standing, civic rule, and craft knowledge were all being arranged at once. The same local order shaped skill, entry, and recognition, so the close of work did not end the social reach of the craft. It simply left that order in place for the next day. That order persisted still. That distinction kept workshop skill tied to social standing. By closing time, the forge belonged to a wider civic order, and that order did not stand still. In Oxford, metalworking rules shifted with trade and period, so smithing followed local arrangements rather than one town-wide pattern. Local organization can be traced in one place, yet it should not be broadened into a kingdom-wide pattern. The workshop, therefore, sat inside a public framework of custom and authority, not beside it. That framework helped decide who could work, how standing was named, and what sort of place the smith held in the town. The shop's routine was never only private labor, it was also part of urban life, where craft and rule met in ordinary ways. A smith at the end of the day was still part of that order, even when the tools were laid aside and the workbench went quiet. The city did not need a single unchanging craft code to keep the trade visible. It could recognize a craft household, set limits on it, and alter those limits as practice changed. That shifting setting matters because the closing hours of the shop are also the hours when law, custom, and labor come into clearer view. The forge was not a lawless room hidden from the town. It was one small place where urban order reached into practical work and gave that work a civic shape. That ending marked the point where private labor met public standing, and that meeting gave craft its place in the city. Apprenticeship sat at the center of that shape, but it did not produce one identical ending for every learner. Training could lead to different prospects, so the same first years did not promise the same future. One apprentice might remain tied to a household workshop, another might move toward independent work, and another could take a different standing altogether. The legal idea of freedom mattered in urban craft life and shifted over time. Even so, the meaning of freedom shifted over time, and that shift changed what a young smith could become. A learner was not simply being copied into a master's shape. He was being placed into a changing world of obligation and release, where status could open a path without fixing its length or finish. That is why apprenticeship belongs to social history as much as to training. It linked skill, household order, and legal standing, but it did so without locking every career into the same pattern. The workshop therefore gathered different futures under one roof. Some futures stayed close to the master, some widened, and some moved into another position in the town. That variety does not make the trade uncertain, it makes it socially real. Closing hours could sharpen that difference, because the day's work ended in a setting where rank and duty were already being sorted into place. The shop ended with open possibilities still arranged within discipline. Later early modern systems, where guilds, contracts, and courts work together, offer a comparison, not a template that can be pressed onto every age. The older craft world shows changing institutional pathways rather than one universal master-apprentice model. Some arrangements tied a learner closely to a master, others left more room for negotiation, movement, and obligation. The road into craft life could therefore bend with local practice and social need. A boy entering one workshop was not stepping onto the same track as every other apprentice in every other town. That difference matters because a workshop at closing time is also a place where those pathways become visible in who remains attached, who can speak for the work, and who stands apart. The trade did not run on one fixed sequence of service, freedom, and independence. It worked through several recognized routes, each with its own standing and obligations. The craft therefore kept its local character. The institutional road into the craft changed across time and place, and the same training could carry different expectations for the person learning it. Such variety belongs to the history of the forge itself, not to a single neat rule. Guild discipline, contractual ties, and the reach of courts each shaped craft life in different combinations, so authority could be distributed rather than centralized. That changing mix kept the trade from hardening into one permanent ladder. The terms of office shifted with each local setting. Craft regulation belongs to the social history of the forge, separate from the iron debris left on the floor. Accounts, agreements, and rules show how work was organized, who answered to whom, and how standing was recognized. Hearth waste marks heating, hammering, and trimming, while authority belonged to the people and institutions around the work. A smith's status at the end of the day is better read through documents than through the scraps underfoot. That is why the closing hours matter in papers as well as in ash. Rank, obligation, and standing shaped how the forge was organized. Debris marks labor without fixing the laborer's rank. By the time the books are shut, what matters is not only what was made, but how the maker fit the town. The workshop's social life survives in the order of names, duties, and payments, where the day's work becomes legible as part of civic life. Material remains still mark an active hearth, while the larger social place depended on rank and obligation. Social standing therefore mattered around the labor itself. The ash might prove that work was done, yet the account explains who was responsible, who was recognized, and who carried the obligations forward into the next day. Those written forms also tied the shop to neighbors, creditors, and officials. They made the forge part of a wider civic order, not a hidden room. The forge's social shape emerged through training, obligation, and standing. The smith could appear in more than one standing at once, perhaps as master, employer, tenant, or some mixture of roles, and each carried different weight in the town. Freedom, obligation, and service could all be folded into that standing, though never in a single fixed form. The same legal language could point in different directions as time moved on, because the terms that framed craft life shifted with circumstance. What the day's books captured was not a private ending, but a civic arrangement. Payment, service, and rank met there, and their balance told a larger story than arithmetic alone. A workshop did not close as an isolated room that simply emptied out. It closed as part of the town's working order, with obligations sorted and status made legible. The quiet of closing time therefore carried social meaning. It marked who belonged, who answered, and who was able to move on within the craft world. That is a practical ending, but it is also a public one, because the account turns labor into recognized place. The same lines in the book could also show whether a man was still advancing, already established, or tied into a more complicated relation with the household of the shop. That is how the end of work becomes part of civic memory. That settled balance also showed how craft life could keep several claims in play at once without losing its public shape. By then, the workshop had become more than a room for heat and iron. It was a point where regulation, apprenticeship, and civic standing met in ordinary life. One town's rules remain local, and no city pattern can be lifted into a general law for every smith. The line from work into accounting and from craft into standing is enough to carry the story onward, and the day can settle without forcing a grand conclusion. The books, the duties, and the place of the worker are enough to keep the movement clear. Nothing needs to be overstated when the close of work has already done so much of the speaking. What remains is a measured order, the kind that follows ordinary labor when town and trade have given it a name. The forge remained a place where work and standing met. It ends in a set of relations that can be read, one after another, as the night deepens and the workshop falls still. That stillness is not emptiness. It is the next condition of the same urban life, with the shop's standing settled for the moment and the wider story ready to continue. The account leaves the workshop poised between work completed and work resumed, and that balance is enough to carry the narrative forward without strain. Nothing in that ending makes the shop grander than it was. It simply leaves the work arranged in a way that the town could carry forward into another day of ordinary urban craft life. Its practical place still depended on local custom and social position. Local custom and social position shaped how urban craft continued through changing institutions. An apprentice entered the forge through a web of obligations, not through a single doorway. Guild rules might shape one part of the arrangement, a private contract another, and a court could settle what the others left open. In a town like Oxford, the rules attached to one craft did not simply fit every other craft in the same way, and smithing had its own path through that crowded world. That matters because the workshop was never only a place for heat and metal, it also stood inside the town's legal habits, where learning a trade meant living with a recognized order of service, repayment, and oversight. That order could be strict without being uniform, and it tied service to a town's sense of fairness, debt, and authority. A boy learned a trade. He entered a relationship that others could recognize, name, and enforce. Later ordinances can make that order look tidy, but they should not be dropped unchanged onto medieval smiths. The practical life of the shop was older, rougher, and more local than that. Around the forge, the apprentice stood at the edge of a system that joined training to obligation, and the same town could send a mason, a weaver, and a smith down different institutional roads. So the first thing to understand is not a romantic idea of craft, but the narrow lane by which a young worker was admitted, watched, and judged, with each step framed by custom that belonged to that place and that trade. The smithy itself left a second kind of order. Rules written for the trade described who might work, who might supervise, and how the craft sat within the town's discipline, while the floor and hearth kept their own trace of the day's labor. Slag, broken pieces, and other waste came from repeated use, but that debris does not sort rank, learning, or paperwork. It belongs to the making of iron, not to the names attached to the workers. This is why the workshop should be read as both a regulated place and a practical one. A city could define the trade from the outside, yet the forge answered with its own physical residue, produced by heating, striking, trimming, and finishing. Seen from the doorway, that residue made the forge look less like an abstract rulebook and more like a room of hard use all its own. Such traces belong to labor at the bench, not biography. The two kinds of order meet at the same site, though they do not speak about the same thing. One concerns permissions and obligations in town life. The other concerns the stubborn leftovers of production. A town's discipline could speak in general terms, but the floor preserved the ordinary consequences of making iron day after day. When you picture the room, think less of a tidy classroom and more of a working floor where the shape of labor remained visible even after the hour was over. That distinction keeps the smithy grounded in ordinary craftwork and avoids letting the visible debris pretend to be a complete social map of the people who moved through it. Apprenticeship itself did not promise one fixed ending. It could become solid training, the route by which a young person learned to judge metal, manage tools, and enter adult craft life, yet it could also leave someone with uncertain prospects after the service ended. That range matters because the term was not simply a waiting room before mastery. It was a social arrangement with several possible futures, some clear and some not. In one case, the years of service led toward competence and standing. In another, they ended in dependence without a secure opening. The same structure could support learning and limit it, because the value of the arrangement depended on how the town, the household, and the trade responded when the term was done. That uncertainty shaped how families, masters, and apprentices treated the term, because the years of learning were also years of waiting on judgment from outside the forge, and in a craft that depended on trust as well as skill, that judgment could matter as much as the hammerwork itself in the long term. So apprenticeship in a smith's world was not just instruction in technique, it was also a test of whether a place in the craft would actually be available at the end of the obligation. That is why the stories of training and uncertainty belong together. They show a system that made skill possible while leaving the outcome uneven, and they keep the apprentice in motion between promise and practical reality. Later European systems can make this world easier to recognize, but only when they stay in their own time. They offer a clearer map of craft learning in a different century, where the rules and expectations were arranged in ways that should not be folded back, unchanged, into the medieval forge. That comparison shows what apprenticeship can look like when institutions become more settled and more explicit. If the periods blur together, it flattens the older workshop into a version of something newer. The point is chronology, not convenience. Medieval smithing sat in a world where the forms of learning, oversight, and advancement were older, local, and uneven, while later European systems belonged to a different social order. The better comparison keeps each period intact and lets the differences do their work. It shows that order in craft life emerged unevenly through local habit rather than a single European pattern. Keeping that divide visible allows the older craft to remain itself. It also keeps the apprenticeship story from becoming a single staircase that all trades climbed in the same way. There were many arrangements, and the smith's trade did not stand apart from them in isolation. It shared the town with other crafts, but it moved through time on its own schedule, shaped by local custom and by the particular balance between teaching, labor, and future position. The social side of a smithy was real, and it mattered precisely because it was ordinary. People met there over repairs, commissions, and obligations, so the place was more than a machine for turning out ironwork. Yet the social life around it remained locally specific. One town's habits of exchange, deference, and access did not simply travel intact to another town, even when both had blacksmiths and apprentices. That is part of what makes the workshop such a revealing place in the evening, when business, reputation, and instruction sit close together without becoming the same thing. The forge could be a social node without being a universal pattern. It held the shape of its own community, the pace of its own trade, and the small network of relations that gave the work meaning. That is why the social world around the forge cannot be reduced to one diagram of guild life or urban custom. It changed with neighborhood, with trade, and with the standing of the people who dealt with the smith. The same bench could sit at the edge of several circles at once. So when a smithy is described as social, the word should stay narrow and practical. It points to relations in that place, among those people, under those local habits. It does not turn the workshop into a neat model for every craft house in Europe, because the social world of ironwork was always anchored in a town, a district, and the routines that grew there. By closing time, the forge was measured as much by obligation as by output. An apprentice's place in the shop was part of a larger set of accounts, where service, instruction, and future standing had to be kept in relation. Accounts gave shape to that uncertainty because they translated service into obligations that could be remembered and settled at the level of the town. Nothing about that reckoning was abstract to the people inside it. It touched the practical business of the craft and the social position attached to it, and it remained bound to local custom rather than to any universal ladder. Closing time, therefore, marked a pause in work, not an end to the social arithmetic of the shop. That is why the end of the day matters here. It is not a dramatic pause, only a moment when the working order becomes visible as a set of settled and unsettled ties. The town's ways of naming craft, judging service, and carrying obligations forward all meet at that hour. The apprentice remains within that pattern, neither fully arrived nor simply outside it, and the work pauses without dissolving the relationships that make it possible. Tomorrow would reopen the same reckoning in a slightly different form. In that quiet closing, the forge looks less like a single task than like a small civic arrangement, one that will open again on the same terms, with the same local balance between learning, labor, and account. By the time the forge reached its closing stretch, its meaning reached beyond iron alone. The work belonged to people as well as metal, and apprentices stood near the center of that order. Apprentices, freedom, and regulation varied from craft to craft and place to place, so no single pattern governed every workshop. In one setting, a young worker might remain attached for longer. In another, status could change sooner, with more room for independence or a different arrangement of service. That variation mattered because the forge was never only a place for striking metal, it was also a place where skill was inherited, supervised, and measured inside a settled social frame. The workshop sat inside a community with habits, obligations, and expectations that shaped who learned, who answered for the work, and who could later stand on their own. Evening did not erase that structure. It simply made it clearer that the trade joined labor to rank, and rank to learning, in a way that moved more slowly than the heat on the hearth. Even the closing accounting of the day would have been social as much as practical, because a smith's shop depended on trust, correction, and the steady transfer of judgment from one hand to another. That is why the last note of the day belongs as much to standing and obligation as to completed work, and why a forge can speak of household order without naming every person who passed through it in the settlement. The workshop itself sets the next layer of meaning. Scattered debris, scale, and other signs of ironworking mark a place that was heated, struck, and kept in use. The floor carries no single moment, only repeated work, and that repetition matters. The structure around the forge also counts. A managed working space needed heat, fuel, tools, and enough room for movement, so the arrangement of the building shaped the craft inside it. A learner could be placed close enough to observe the shaping of iron, yet far enough from danger to remain useful in the routine of the shop. The debris and the written terms together set the workshop scene and its social boundaries. One side shows where the labor happened, the other defines who belonged within it and under what standing. Together they present a forge that was both physical and regulated, both a place of heat and a place of order. The public side of the craft reached outward from that room into the life of the settlement, because tools and fittings passed on to households, fields, and animals that depended on them. Even so, the room itself remained central, since the same layout that held the iron also held the relations of labor. What survives here is a working space that explains why craft knowledge could be passed on steadily through repeated practice rather than sudden revelation, and why the smith's trade was anchored in the daily life around it. Its plain order kept work legible nearby. The wider pattern appears from a different angle. It shows organized craft learning without promising a single ending for every apprentice. The blacksmith's shop belonged to a structured path of obligation, supervision, and skill, and that path could last different lengths depending on craft and place. Some learners remained bound to a master longer, others reached freedom earlier, and the balance between service and independence shifted across settings. That is enough to keep the story from becoming a simple tale of rank rising in a straight line. Training shaped the person, but it did not remove all other ties at once. A young worker could belong to a household, a shop, and a trade at the same time, and each tie carried its own expectation. In that sense, the forge was as much a social school as a place of labor. It taught how to answer to authority, how to follow established practice, and how to measure work against a craft standard that was larger than one hand or one season. The important point is the arrangement itself. Learning was public, disciplined, and part of an ordered life. The day closed, but the structure did not vanish with the tools. It remained in the relation between the person who supervised and the person still learning how the craft was counted. Freedom could mark progress, but it did not erase dependence, and continued service did not always mean failure or delay. Both fit the same craft world. A wider view of craft history helps place the forge without swallowing the village story. Towns often developed denser regulation, stronger guild life, and more writing around learning and freedom. A smaller settlement could borrow some habits from that world and still remain different in pace, pressure, and scale. That difference matters because the smith's trade did not float outside society. It sat inside a network of custom, competence, and standing that shaped daily life. The legal side drew boundaries around service and authority, while the material side showed where the work actually happened. Each side needs the other. Without the physical remains, there would be no clear workshop. Without the social frame, the room would be only a place with fire and iron. Together they show why the craft mattered beyond the hearth. Tools, fittings, and repairs connected the forge to neighbors, fields, carts, and horses, but they also connected it to expectations about who could practice the trade and under what terms. Urban comparison therefore sharpens the picture instead of replacing it. It reminds us that institutions could be formal in one setting and looser in another, yet still produce a recognizable craft order. The village workshop belongs to that wider history, but it keeps its own proportions. Its rules were lived close to the work itself, not in some distant abstraction, and that closeness helped define the smith's place in the settlement. That made the workshop a public standard of competence for the people around it. The closing note has to remain modest. A workshop can show organized learning, but it cannot promise one ending for the apprentice who passed through it. One young smith might have gained freedom and remained in the trade. Another might have moved elsewhere, changed work, or stayed attached in some altered form. Those possibilities sit naturally beside one another, because freedom did not erase dependence at once, and service did not always mean failure or delay. The craft world allowed different outcomes, and the balance of obligation could shift without turning the story into triumph or loss. What matters here is the social frame around the forge, who held authority, who learned under supervision, and how status changed over time. The same frame explains why the physical remains can be so plain and still so revealing. They show an active, ordered workplace. The surrounding rules give that activity a place in the wider life of the settlement. A quiet conclusion keeps the proportions right. It lets the workshop stand as a place where skill was passed on step by step, with no need to invent a final career for every pair of hands that once worked there. The historical picture is fuller when it leaves room for more than one future, because the craft itself did. The forge closes as part of that larger system, not as the end of the people who learned there. That restraint leaves the apprentice's future inside the community where it always belonged there. By the final turn of the story, the forge can be left as it stands, a place of work, training, and local order. Its debris, layout, and social setting point to a craft that was active and organized, yet never reducible to iron alone. In this episode's frame, the forge closes as a scene, not a complete biography. That is the right scale for the ending, because the workshop can show how labor was arranged without pretending to finish the lives that passed through it. Apprenticeship, freedom, and regulation varied, and that variety belongs at the center of the story rather than at its margin. The room, therefore, remains a chapter in a larger way of life, one shared by households, masters, learners, and the community that depended on their trade. It is enough to see the setting, the social boundaries, and the different possibilities that opened after training. There is no need to force a single destiny where the past leaves several. The forge can end its part of the tale, while the people who worked there remain part of a wider settlement, shaped by custom and by the measured transfer of skill. That quiet finish suits a craft that mattered because it was ordinary, necessary, and deeply embedded in daily life. The last note is not the story of one finished career. It is the closing of a workshop scene that still points beyond its walls. Its silence marks a boundary, not a conclusion for anyone here. By the end, the forge reads less like a single moment than a working zone gathered around heat and purpose. Bellows, anvils, hearths, and the scattered waste of iron together mark a place where metal was shaped, struck, and finished, though they do not pin down a precise timetable. That mixture matters because it places the smith within a practical rhythm already shared by the building itself. A workshop like this could hold more than one kind of labor at once, and the tools for shaping iron sat beside the remains of past work without announcing exactly when each task began or ended. In that setting, the day's close is not a dramatic break. It is simply the point at which the active use of the space gives way to a quieter order, with the forge still defined by what it had been made to do. The result is ordinary medieval craft, rather than a fixed schedule for the people who used it. That wider order was social as well as material. Apprenticeship and guild practice belonged to documentary social history, not to slag alone, so the people around the forge must be understood through the habits of training, standing, and obligation that shaped craft life. Early modern apprenticeship offers context, though not a direct medieval rulebook, and it reminds us that organized learning often tied skill to supervision and to the gradual earning of trust. Even so, the workshop itself does not speak in ranks. Ironworking waste indicates task completion, not identity or status, and the remnants left behind should not be pressed into naming who held the hammer or how long they had worked there. What remains is a craft order in which knowledge moved through practice and permission, not through a single frozen formula. That makes the forge part of a larger civic world, while still keeping the medieval workshop in its own time for the towns and villages that relied on it. In that world, repair mattered as much as making new pieces. The repair story ends with iron staying in circulation through ordinary service, which means a broken tool could return to use without becoming anything grander than useful again. Repair work can coexist with domestic and agricultural demands without proving one universal sequence, so the forge belonged to the settled round of household and field as much as to any specialist schedule. A plough fitting, a cart part, or a worn edge did not need a separate public drama. They needed practical attention and then more work. That is why the blacksmith's role sits so securely between town and countryside. The same labor could answer the needs of farming, transport, and daily maintenance without forcing those tasks into one neat order. What the repaired iron offered was continuity, not spectacle, and continuity is often the most revealing kind of usefulness for another round of ordinary work in field, road, and shop when needed. Seen from farther out, the workshop also fits into a broader pattern of mixed skills. Karpang shows overlapping skills in a workshop setting, which calls for caution when defining tasks, because craft work could cluster and overlap instead of dividing cleanly. Urban craft history helps compare institutions, yet it does not tell the whole village story, and that is useful here because the smithy in a rural setting answered needs that towns handled through different arrangements. The port city and the village building can therefore be compared but not collapsed into one model. Each gives a different measure of how iron moved through daily life, how labor was organized, and how service continued after the hardest striking was done. By the time the light has passed from the hearth, The work is already turning outward again, back toward the roads, fields, and roofs that will call for it next, with no need for ceremony or pause before the next round of work begins.